Welcome to Luminous Antiquity. Tonight, we begin Thucydides' monumental The History of the Peloponnesian War, Book 1. Prepare to drift into restful sleep or focused study as we unravel the very foundations of one of ancient Greece's most pivotal conflicts. You've come for serene, historical narration, and that's exactly what awaits you. Prepare to drift into restful sleep or focused study as we unravel the very foundations of one of ancient Greece's most pivotal conflicts. You've come for serene, historical narration, and that's exactly what awaits you. But what truly drives nations to war? Why did two of the most powerful city-states in the ancient world, Athens, a burgeoning democracy, and Sparta, a disciplined oligarchy, become locked in a struggle that would reshape the Aegean for centuries? Thucydides, an Athenian general who lived through and meticulously documented this very war, promises to reveal not just what happened, but why it was inevitable. He doesn't just record events. He dissects the human ambition and fear that fueled them. Here at Luminous Antiquity, we pair these timeless narratives with calming, low-stimulation visuals and gentle ambient sounds, scientifically tuned to support your natural sleep or deep concentration. No jarring noises, no bright lights, just pure, immersive history designed for ultimate relaxation and focus. Let the wisdom of the ancients guide you into a state of peace. Before we delve into Book 1, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about your favorite aspect of ancient history, and subscribe to Luminous Antiquity for more journeys into the past. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians. He began at the moment it broke out, believing it would be a great war, more worthy of record than any that had preceded it. This belief was not without its grounds. The preparations of both combatants were, in every department, at their peak, and he could see the rest of the Hellenic world taking sides in the quarrel. Those who delayed doing so immediately were certainly contemplating it. Indeed, this was the greatest movement yet known in history, not only for the Hellenes, but for a large part of the barbarian world. I had almost said for all mankind. For though the events of remote antiquity, and even those that more immediately preceded the war, could not, due to the passage of time, be clearly ascertained, yet the evidence which an inquiry, carried as far back as was practicable, leads me to trust, all points to one conclusion. There was nothing on a truly great scale, either in war or in other matters. For instance, it's clear that the country now called Hellas had, in ancient times, no settled population. On the contrary, migrations were frequent. The various tribes readily abandoned their homes under the pressure of superior numbers. Without commerce, without freedom of communication either by land or sea, cultivating no more their territory than the necessities of life required, destitute of capital, never planting their land, for they couldn't tell when an invader might come and take it all away, and when he did come, they had no walls to stop him, thinking that daily sustenance could be supplied at one place as well as another. They cared little for shifting their habitation. Consequently, they neither built large cities nor attained any other form of greatness. The richest soils were always most subject to this change of masters, such as the district now called Thessaly, Boeotia, most of the Peloponnese, with the exception of Arcadia, and the most fertile parts of the rest of Hellas. The richness of the land favored the rise of powerful individuals, thus creating factions which proved a fertile source of ruin. It also invited invasion. Accordingly, Attica, from the poverty of its soil, enjoyed, from a very remote period, freedom from faction and never changed its inhabitants. And here is no small example of my assertion, that these migrations were the reason for the lack of corresponding growth in other parts. The most powerful victims of war or faction from the rest of Hellas took refuge with the Athenians as a safe retreat. And at an early period, becoming naturalized, they swelled the already large population of the city to such a height that Attica became at last too small to hold them. They had to send out colonies to Ionia. There is also another circumstance that contributes not a little to my conviction of the weakness of ancient times. Before the Trojan War, there is no indication of any common action in Hellas, nor indeed of the universal prevalence of the name Hellas. On the contrary, before the time of Hellen, son of Deucalion, no such appellation existed. Instead, the country went by the names of its different tribes, particularly the Pelasgian. It was not until Hellen and his sons grew strong in Thyotis and were invited as allies into other cities that one by one they gradually acquired, from these connections, the name Hellenes. Though a long time elapsed before that name could fasten itself upon all. The best proof of this is furnished by Homer. Born long after the Trojan War, he nowhere calls all of them by that name, nor indeed any of them, except the followers of Achilles from Thyotis, who were the original Hellenes. In his poems, they are called Danaans, Argives, and Achaeans. He does not even use the term barbarian, probably because the Hellenes had not yet been marked off from the rest of the world by one distinctive appellation. It appears, therefore, that the several Hellenic communities, comprising not only those who first acquired the name, city by city, as they came to understand each other, but also those who assumed it afterwards as the name of the whole people, were before the Trojan War prevented by their lack of strength and the absence of mutual intercourse from displaying any collective action. Indeed, they could not unite for this expedition until they had gained increased familiarity with the sea. And the first person known to us by tradition as having established a navy is Minos. He made himself master of what is now called the Hellenic Sea and ruled over the Cyclades. Into most of these islands he sent the first colonies, expelling the Carians and appointing his own sons as governors. And thus he did his best to put down piracy in those waters, a necessary step to secure the revenues for his own use. For in early times, the Hellenes and the barbarians of the coast and islands, as communication by sea became more common, were tempted to turn pirates under the conduct of their most powerful men. The motives were to serve their own greed and to support the needy. They would fall upon a town unprotected by walls, often just a collection of villages, and plunder it. Indeed, this came to be the main source of their livelihood, no disgrace being yet attached to such an achievement, but even some glory. An illustration of this is furnished by the honor with which some inhabitants of the continent still regard a successful marauder, and by the question we find the old poets everywhere representing people as asking of voyagers, "Are they pirates?" As if those asked the question would have no idea of disclaiming the imputation, or their interrogators reproaching them for it. The same rapine prevailed also by land, and even at the present day, many in Hellas still follow the old fashion. The Ozolian Locrians, for instance, the Aetolians, the Acarnanians, and that region of the continent. And the custom of carrying arms is still kept up among these continentals from the old piratical habits. The whole of Hellas used once to carry arms, their habitations being unprotected and their communication with each other unsafe. Indeed, to wear arms was as much a part of everyday life with them as with the barbarians. And the fact that the people in these parts of Hellas are still living in the old way points to a time when the same mode of life was once equally common to all. The Athenians were the first to lay aside their weapons and to adopt an easier and more luxurious mode of life. Indeed, it is only lately that their rich old men left off the luxury of wearing linen undergarments and fastening a knot of their hair with a tie of golden grasshoppers, a fashion which spread to their Ionian kindred and long prevailed among the old men there. On the contrary, a more modest style of dressing, more in conformity with modern ideas, was first adopted by the Lacedaemonians. The rich did their best to assimilate their way of life to that of the common people. They also set the example of contending naked, publicly stripping and anointing themselves with oil in their gymnastic exercises. Formerly, even in the Olympic contests, the athletes who competed wore belts across their middles, and it is but a few years since that practice ceased. To this day, among some of the barbarians, especially in Asia, when prizes for boxing and wrestling are offered, belts are worn by the combatants. And there are many other points in which a likeness might be shown between the life of the Hellenic world of old and the barbarian of today. With respect to their towns, later on, at an era of increased facilities for navigation and a greater supply of capital, we find the shores becoming the site of walled towns, and the isthmuses being occupied for purposes of commerce and defense against neighbors. But the old towns, because of the great prevalence of piracy, were built away from the sea, whether on the islands or the continent, and still remain in their old sites. For the pirates used to plunder one another, and indeed all coast populations, whether seafaring or not. The islanders, too, were great pirates. These islanders were Carians and Phoenicians, by whom most of the islands were colonized, as was proved by the following fact. During the purification of Delos by Athens in this war, all the graves in the island were taken up. It was found that over half their occupants were Carians. They were identified by the fashion of the arms buried with them, and by the method of interment, which was the same as the Carians still follow. But as soon as Minos had formed his navy, communication by sea became easier as he colonized most of the islands, thus expelling the malefactors. The coastal population now began to apply themselves more closely to the acquisition of wealth, and their life became more settled. Some even began to build themselves walls on the strength of their newly acquired riches. For the love of gain would reconcile the weaker to the dominion of the stronger, and the possession of capital enabled the more powerful to reduce the smaller towns to subjection. And it was at a somewhat later stage of this development that they went on the expedition against Troy. What enabled Agamemnon to raise the army was more, in my opinion, his superiority in strength, rather than the oaths of Tyndareus, which bound the suitors to follow him. Indeed, the account given by those Peloponnesians who have received the most credible tradition is this. First of all, Pelops, arriving among a needy population from Asia with vast wealth, acquired such power that, stranger though he was, the country was named after him. And this power, fortune saw fit materially to increase in the hands of his descendants. Eurystheus had been killed in Attica by the Heraclids. Atreus was his mother's brother, and to the hands of his relation, who had left his father on account of the death of Chrysippus, Eurystheus, when he set out on his expedition, had committed Mycenae and the government. As time went on, and Eurystheus did not return, Atreus complied with the wishes of the Mycenaeans, who were influenced by fear of the Heraclids. Besides, his power seemed considerable, and he had not neglected to court the favor of the populace. He then assumed the scepter of Mycenae and the rest of the dominions of Eurystheus. And so the power of the descendants of Pelops came to be greater than that of the descendants of Perseus. To all this, Agamemnon succeeded. He also had a navy far stronger than his contemporaries, so that, in my opinion, fear was quite as strong an element as love in the formation of the Confederate expedition. The strength of his navy is shown by the fact that his own was the largest contingent, and that of the Arcadians was furnished by him. This, at least, is what Homer says if his testimony is deemed sufficient. Besides, in his account of the transmission of the scepter, he calls him, of many an isle, and of all Argo's king. Now Agamemnon was a continental power, and he could not have been master of any except the adjacent islands, and these would not be many, but through the possession of a fleet. And from this expedition, we may infer the character of earlier enterprises. Now, Mycenae may have been a small place, and many of the towns of that age may appear comparatively insignificant, but no exact observer would therefore feel justified in rejecting the estimate given by the poets and by tradition of the magnitude of the armament. For I suppose if Lacedaemon were to become desolate, and only the temples and the foundations of the public buildings were left, that as time went on there would be a strong disposition with posterity to refuse to accept her fame as a true exponent of her power. And yet they occupy 2/5 of Peloponnese and lead the whole, not to speak of their numerous allies without. Still, as the city is neither built in a compact form nor adorned with magnificent temples and public edifices, but composed of villages after the old fashion of Hellas, there would be an impression of inadequacy. Whereas, if Athens were to suffer the same misfortune, I suppose that any inference from the appearance presented to the eye would make her power to have been twice as great as it is. We have therefore no right to be skeptical, nor to content ourselves with an inspection of a town to the exclusion of a consideration of its true power. But we may safely conclude that the armament in question surpassed all before it, even as it fell short of modern efforts. If we can also accept the testimony of Homer's poems, in which, without allowing for the exaggeration which a poet would feel himself licensed to employ, we can see that it was far from equaling ours. He has represented it as consisting of 1,200 vessels, the Boeotian complement of each ship being 120 men, that of the ships of Philoctetes 50. By this, I conceive, he meant to convey the maximum and the minimum complement. At any rate, he does not specify the amount of any others in his catalogue of the ships. That they were all rowers as well as warriors we see from his account of the ships of Philoctetes, in which all the men at the oar are bowmen. Now, it is improbable that many supernumeraries sailed, if we accept the kings and high officers, especially as they had to cross the open sea with munitions of war, in ships, moreover, that had no decks, but were equipped in the old piratical fashion. So that if we strike the average of the largest and smallest ships, the number of those who sailed will appear inconsiderable, representing, as they did, the whole force of Hellas. And this was due not so much to scarcity of men as of money. Difficulty of subsistence made the invaders reduce the numbers of the army to a point at which it might live on the country during the prosecution of the war, even after the victory they obtained on their arrival. And a victory there must have been, or the fortifications of the naval camp could never have been built. There is no indication of their whole force having been employed. On the contrary, they seem to have turned to cultivation of the Chersonese and to piracy from want of supplies. This was what really enabled the Trojans to keep the field for 10 years against them, the dispersion of the enemy making them always a match for the detachment left behind. If they had brought plenty of supplies with them, and had persevered in the war without scattering for piracy and agriculture, they would have easily defeated the Trojans in the field, since they could hold their own against them with the division on service. In short, if they had stuck to the siege, the capture of Troy would have cost them less time and less trouble. But as want of money proved the weakness of earlier expeditions, so from the same cause, even the one in question, more famous than its predecessors, may be pronounced, on the evidence of what it effected, to have been inferior to its renown and to the current opinion about it formed under the tuition of the poets. Even after the Trojan War, Hellas was still engaged in removing and settling, and thus could not attain the quiet which must precede growth. The late return of the Hellenes from Ilium caused many revolutions, and factions ensued almost everywhere. And it was the citizens thus driven into exile who founded the cities. 60 years after the capture of Ilium, the modern Boeotians were driven out of Arne by the Thessalians and settled in the present Boeotia, the former Cadmeis, though there was a division of them there before, some of whom joined the expedition to Ilium. 20 years later, the Dorians and the Heraclids became masters of Peloponnese. So much had to be done, and many years had to elapse before Hellas could attain to a durable tranquility undisturbed by removals, and could begin to send out colonies, as Athens did to Ionia and most of the islands, and the Peloponnesians to most of Italy and Sicily, and some places in the rest of Hellas. All these places were founded subsequently to the war with Troy. But as the power of Hellas grew, and the acquisition of wealth became more an object, the revenues of the states increased, tyrannies were by their means established almost everywhere. The old form of government had been hereditary monarchy with definite prerogatives, and Hellas began to fit out fleets and apply herself more closely to the sea. It is said that the Corinthians were the first to approach the modern style of naval architecture, and that Corinth was the first place in Hellas where galleys were built. And we have Amenocles, Corinthian shipwright, making 4 ships for the Samians. Dating from the end of this war, it is nearly 300 years ago that Amenocles went to Samos. Again, the earliest sea fight in history was between the Corinthians and Corcyraeans. This was about 260 years ago, dating from the same time. Planted on an isthmus, Corinth had, from time out of mind, been a commercial emporium. As formerly almost all communication between the Hellenes within and without Peloponnese was carried on overland, the Corinthian territory was the highway through which it traveled. She had consequently great money resources, as is shown by the epithet wealthy bestowed by the old poets on the place. And this enabled her, when traffic by sea became more common, to procure her navy and put down piracy. And as she could offer a market for both branches of the trade, she acquired for herself all the power which a large revenue affords. Subsequently, the Ionians attained great naval strength in the reign of Cyrus, the first king of the Persians, and of his son Cambyses. While they were at war with Cyrus, they commanded for a while the Ionian Sea. Polycrates also, the tyrant of Samos, had a powerful navy in the reign of Cambyses, with which he reduced many of the islands, and among them Rhenea, which he consecrated to the Delian Apollo. About this time also the Phocians, while they were founding Marseilles, defeated the Carthaginians in a sea fight. These are the most powerful navies. And even these, although so many generations had elapsed since the Trojan War, seem to have been principally composed of the old 50 oars and longboats, and to have counted few galleys among their ranks. Indeed, it was only shortly after the Persian War and the death of Darius, the successor of Cambyses, that the Sicilian tyrants and the Corcyraeans acquired any large number of galleys. For after these there were no navies of any account in Hellas till the expedition of Xerxes. Aegina, Athens, and others may have possessed a few vessels, but they were principally 50 oars. It was quite at the end of this period that the war with Aegina and the prospect of the barbarian invasion enabled Themistocles to persuade the Athenians to build the fleet with which they fought at Salamis, and even these vessels had not complete decks. The navies, then, of the Hellenes during the period we have traversed were what I have described. All their insignificance did not prevent their being an element of the greatest power to those who cultivated them, alike in revenue and in dominion. They were the means by which the islands were reached and reduced, those of the smallest area falling the easiest prey. Wars by land there were none at least by which power was acquired. We have the usual border contests, but of distant expeditions with conquest for objects we hear nothing among the Hellenes. There was no union of subject cities around a great state, no spontaneous combination of equals for Confederate expeditions. What fighting there consisted merely of local warfare between rival neighbors. The nearest approach to a coalition took place in the Old War between Chalcis and Eretria. This was a quarrel in which the rest of the Hellenic name did to some extent take sides. Various, too, were the obstacles which the national growth encountered in various localities. The power of the Ionians was advancing with rapid strides when it came into collision with Persia under King Cyrus, who, after having dethroned Croesus and overrun everything between the Halys and the sea, stopped not till he had reduced the cities of the coast. The islands were only left to be subdued by Darius and the Phoenician navy. Again, wherever there were tyrants, their habit of providing simply for themselves, of looking solely to their personal comfort and family aggrandizement, made safety the great aim of their policy and prevented anything great proceeding from them, though they would each have their affairs with their immediate neighbors. All this is only true of the mother country, for in Sicily they attained to very great power. Thus, for a long time everywhere in Hellas do we find causes which make the states alike incapable of combination for great and national ends, or of any vigorous action of their own. But at last a time came when the tyrants of Athens and the far older tyrannies of the rest of Hellas were, with the exception of those in Sicily, once and for all put down by Lacedaemon. For this city, though after the settlement of the Dorians, its present inhabitants, it suffered from factions for an unparalleled length of time, still at a very early period obtained good laws, and enjoyed a freedom from tyrants which was unbroken. It has possessed the same form of government for more than 400 years, reckoning to the end of the late war, and has thus been in a position to arrange the affairs of the other states. Not many years after the deposition of the tyrants, the Battle of Marathon was fought between the Medes and the Athenians. 10 years afterwards, the barbarian returned with the armada for the subjugation of Hellas. In the face of this great danger, the command of the Confederate Hellenes was assumed by the Lacedaemonians in virtue of their superior power, and the Athenians, having made up their minds to abandon their city, broke up their homes, threw themselves into their ships, and became a naval people. This coalition, after repulsing the barbarian, soon afterwards split into two sections, which included the Hellenes who had revolted from the king, as well as those who had aided him in the war. At the end of the one stood Athens, at the head of the other Lacedaemon, one the first naval, the other the first military power in Hellas. For a short time the league held together, till the Lacedaemonians and Athenians quarreled and made war upon each other with their allies, a duel into which all the Hellenes sooner or later were drawn, though some might at first remain neutral. So that the whole period from the Median War to this, with some peaceful intervals, was spent by each power in war, either with its rival or with its own revolted allies, and consequently afforded them constant practice in military matters, and that experience which is learned in the school of danger. The policy of Lacedaemon was not to exact tribute from her allies, but merely to secure their subservience to her interests by establishing oligarchies among them. Athens, on the contrary, had by degrees deprived hers of their ships, and imposed instead contributions in money on all except Chios and Lesbos. Both found their resources for this war separately to exceed the sum of their strength when the alliance flourished intact. Having now given the result of my inquiries into early times, I grant that there will be a difficulty in believing every particular detail. The way that most men deal with traditions, even traditions of their own country, is to receive them all alike as they are delivered, without applying any critical test whatsoever. The general Athenian public fancy that Hipparchus was tyrant when he fell by the hands of Harmodius and Aristogiton, not knowing that Hippias, the eldest of the sons of Pisistratus, was really supreme, and that Hipparchus and Thessalus were his brothers, and that Harmodius and Aristogiton, suspecting on the very day, nay, at the very moment fixed on for the deed, that information had been conveyed to Hippias by their accomplices, concluded that he had been warned and did not attack him. Yet, not liking to be apprehended and risking their lives for nothing, they fell upon Hipparchus near the temple of the daughters of Laos, and slew him as he was arranging the Panathenaic procession. There are many other unfounded ideas currently among the rest of the Hellenes, even on matters of contemporary history, which have not been obscured by time. For instance, there is the notion that the Lacedaemonian kings have 2 votes each, the fact being that they have only one, and that there is a company of Pitane, there being simply no such thing. So little pains do the vulgar take in the investigation of truth, accepting readily the first story that comes to hand. On the whole, however, the conclusions I have drawn from the proofs quoted may, I believe, safely be relied on. Assuredly, they will not be disturbed either by the lies of a poet, displaying the exaggeration of his craft, or by the compositions of the chroniclers that are attractive at truth's expense. The subjects they treat as being out of the reach of evidence, and time having robbed most of them of historical value by enthroning them in the region of legend. Turning from these, we can rest satisfied with having proceeded upon the clearest data, and having arrived at conclusions as exact as can be expected in matters of such antiquity. To come to this war, despite the known disposition of the actors in a struggle to overrate its importance, and when it is over to return to their admiration of earlier events, yet an examination of the facts will show that it was much greater than the wars which preceded it. With reference to the speeches in this history, some were delivered before the war began, others while it was going on. Some I heard myself, others I got from various quarters. It was in all cases difficult to carry them word for word in one's memory. So my habit has been to make the speakers say what was, in my opinion, demanded of them by the various occasions. Of course, adhering as closely as possible to the general sense of what they really said. And with reference to the narrative of events, far from permitting myself to derive it from the first source that came at hand, I did not even trust my own impressions, but it rests partly on what I saw myself, partly on what others saw for me, the accuracy of the report being always tried by the most severe and detailed tests possible. My conclusions have cost me some labor from the want of coincidence between accounts of the same occurrences by different eyewitnesses, arising sometimes from imperfect memory, sometimes from undue partiality for one side or the other. The absence of romance in my history will, I fear, detract somewhat from its interest. But if it be judged useful by those inquirers who desire an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to the interpretation of the future, which in the course of human things must resemble, if it does not reflect it, I shall be content. In fine, I have written my work not as an essay which is to win the applause of the moment, but as a possession for all time. The Median War, the greatest achievement of past time, yet found a speedy decision in 2 actions by sea and 2 by land. The Peloponnesian War was prolonged to an immense length, and, long as it was short without parallel for the misfortunes that it brought upon Hellas. Never had so many cities been taken and laid desolate, here by the barbarians, here by the parties contending, the old inhabitants being sometimes removed to make room for others. Never was there so much banishing and bloodshedding, now on the field of battle, now in the strife of faction. Old stories of occurrences handed down by tradition, but scantily confirmed by experience, suddenly ceased to be incredible. There were earthquakes of unparalleled extent and violence. Eclipses of the sun occurred with a frequency unrecorded in previous history. There were great droughts in sundry places and consequent famines, and that most calamitous and awfully fatal visitation, the plague. All this came upon them with the late war, which was begun by the Athenians and Peloponnesians by the dissolution of the 30 years' truce made after the conquest of Euboea. To the question why they broke the treaty, I answer by placing first an account of their grounds of complaint and points of difference, that no one may ever have to ask the immediate cause which plunged the Hellenes into a war of such magnitude. The real cause I consider to be the one which was formerly most kept out of sight, with a slight pause and emphasis, the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which inspired in Lacedaemon made war inevitable. Still, it is good to give the grounds alleged by either side which led to the dissolution of the treaty and the breaking out of the war. Chapter 2. The city of Epidamnus stands on the right of the entrance of the Ionic Gulf. Its vicinity is inhabited by the Pelasgians, an Illyrian people. The place is a colony from Corcyra, founded by Phallius, son of Eratoclides, of the family of the Heraclids, who had, according to ancient usage, been summoned for the purpose from Corinth, the mother country. The colonists were joined by some Corinthians and others of the Dorian race. Now, as time went on, the city of Epidamnus became great and populous, but falling prey to factions, arising, it is said, from a war with her neighbors, the barbarians, she became much enfeebled and lost a considerable amount of her power. The last act before the war was the expulsion of the nobles by the people. The exiled party joined the barbarians and proceeded to plunder those in the city by sea and land. And the Epidamnians, finding themselves hard-pressed, sent ambassadors to Corcyra, beseeching their mother country not to allow them to perish, but to make up matters between them and the exiles, and to rid them of the war with the barbarians. The ambassadors seated themselves in the temple of Hera as supplicants, and made the above request to the Corcyrians. But the Corcyrians refused to accept their supplication, and they were dismissed without having effected anything. When the Epidamnians found that no help could be expected from Corcyra, they were in a quandary about what to do next. So they sent to Delphi and inquired of the god whether they should deliver their city to the Corinthians and endeavor to obtain some assistance from their founders. The answer he gave them was to deliver the city and place themselves under Corinthian protection. So the Epidamnians went to Corinth and delivered over the colony in obedience to the commands of the oracle. They showed that their founder came from Corinth and revealed the answer of the god, and they begged them not to allow them to perish, but to assist them. This the Corinthians consented to do, believing the colony to belong as much to themselves as to the Corcyrians. They felt it to be a kind of duty to undertake their protection. Besides, they hated the Corcyrians for their contempt of the mother country. Instead of meeting with the usual honors accorded to the parent city by every other colony at public assemblies, such as precedence at sacrifices, Corinth found herself treated with contempt by a power which, in point of wealth, could stand comparison with any even of the richest communities in Hellas, which possessed great military strength, and which sometimes could not repress a pride in the high naval position of an island whose nautical renown dated from the days of its old inhabitants, the Phaeacians. This was one reason for the care that they lavished on their fleet, which became very efficient. Indeed, they began the war with a force of 120 galleys. All these grievances made Corinth eager to send the promised aid to Epidamnus. Advertisement was made for volunteer settlers, and a force of Ambraciots, Leucadians, and Corinthians was dispatched. They marched by land to Apollonia, a Corinthian colony, the route by sea being avoided from fear of Corcyrian interruption. When the Corcyrians heard of the arrival of the settlers and troops in Epidamnus, and the surrender of the colony to Corinth, they took fire, instantly putting to sea with 25 ships, which were quickly followed by others. They insolently commanded the Epidamnians to receive back the banished nobles. It must be premised that the Epidamnian exiles had come to Corcyra and, pointing to the sepulchres of their ancestors, had appealed to their kindred to restore them. and to dismiss the Corinthian garrison and settlers. But to all this the Epidamnians turn a deaf ear. Upon this, the Corcyraeans commenced operations against them with a fleet of 40 sails. They took with them the exiles, with a view to their restoration, and also secured the services of the Illyrians. Sitting down before the city, they issued a proclamation to the effect that any of the natives that chose and the foreigners might depart unharmed, with the alternative of being treated as enemies. On their refusal, the Corcyraeans proceeded to besiege the city, which stands on an isthmus. And the Corinthians, receiving intelligence from the investment of Epidamnus, got together an armament and proclaimed a colony to Epidamnus, perfect political equality being guaranteed to all who chose to go. Any who were not prepared to sail at once might, by paying down the sum of 50 Corinthian drachmae, have a share in the colony without leaving Corinth. Great numbers took advantage of this proclamation, some being ready to start directly, others paying the requisite forfeit. In case of their passage being disputed by the Corcyraeans, several cities were asked to lend them a convoy. Megara prepared to accompany them with 8 ships, Pale and Cephalonia with 4, Epidaurus furnished 5, Hermione 1, Treason 2, Leucas 10, and Ambracia 8. The Thebans and Phlyaesians were asked for money, the Hellenes for hulls as well, while Corinth herself furnished 30 ships and 3,000 heavy infantry. When the Corcyraeans heard of their preparations, they came to Corinth with envoys from Lacedaemon and Sicyon, whom they persuaded to accompany them, and bade her recall the garrison and settlers, as she had nothing to do with Epidamnus. If, however, she had any claims to make, they were willing to submit the matter to the arbitration of such of the cities in Peloponnese as should be chosen by mutual agreement, and that the colony should remain with the city to whom the arbitrators might assign it. They were also willing to refer the matter to the oracle at Delphi. If, in defiance of their protestations, war was appealed to, they should be themselves compelled by this violence to seek friends in quarters where they had no desire to seek them, and to make even old ties give way to the necessity of assistance. The answer they got from Corinth was that if they would withdraw their fleet and the barbarians from Epidamnus, negotiation might be possible, but while the town was still being besieged, going before arbitrators was out of the question. The Corcyraeans retorted that if Corinth would withdraw her troops from Epidamnus, they would withdraw theirs, or they were ready to let both parties remain in status quo, an armistice being concluded till judgment could be given. Turning a deaf ear to all these proposals, when their ships were manned and their allies had come in, the Corinthians sent a herald before them to declare war, and, getting underway with 75 ships and 2,000 heavy infantry, sailed for Epidamnus to give battle to the Corcyraeans. The fleet was under the command of Aristeus, son of Pelecas, Callicrates, son of Callias, and Timoner, son of Timanthes, the troops under that of Archetimus, son of Eurydamus, and Isarchidas, son of Isarchus. When they had reached Actium in the territory of Anactorium, at the mouth of the Gulf of Ambracia, where the temple of Apollo stands, the Corcyraeans sent a herald in a light boat to warn them not to sail against them. Meanwhile, they proceeded to man their ships, all of which had been equipped for action, the old vessels being undergirded to make them seaworthy. On the return of the herald, without any peaceful answer from the Corinthians, their ships being now manned, they put out to sea to meet the enemy with a fleet of 80 sail. 40 were engaged in the siege of Epidamnus, formed line, and went into action, and gained a decisive victory, and destroyed 15 of the Corinthian vessels. The same day had seen Epidamnus compelled by its besiegers to capitulate, the conditions being that the foreigners should be sold, and the Corinthians kept as prisoners of war, till their fate should be otherwise decided. After the engagement, the Corcyraeans set up a trophy on Leucium, a headland of Corcyra, and slew all their captives except the Corinthians, whom they kept as prisoners of war. Defeated at sea, the Corinthians and their allies repaired home, and left the Corcyraeans masters of all the sea about those parts. Sailing to Leucas, a Corinthian colony, they ravaged their territory and burnt Cyllene, the harbor of the Hellenes, because they had furnished ships and money to Corinth. For almost the whole of the period that followed the battle, they remained masters of the sea, and the allies of Corinth were harassed by Corcyraean cruisers. At last Corinth, roused by the sufferings of her allies, sent out ships and troops in the fall of the summer, who formed an encampment at Actium and about Chimerium, in Thesprotis, for the protection of Leucas and the rest of the friendly cities. The Corcyraeans on their part formed a similar station on Leucium. Neither party made any movement, but they remained confronting each other till the end of the summer, and winter was at hand before either of them returned home. Corinth, exasperated by the war with the Corcyraeans, spent the whole of the year after the engagement, and that succeeding it, in building ships, and in straining every nerve to form an efficient fleet, rowers being drawn from Peloponnese and the rest of Hellas by the inducement of large bounties. The Corcyraeans, alarmed at the news of their preparations, being without a single ally in Hellas, for they had not enrolled themselves either in the Athenian or in the Lacedaemonian Confederacy, decided to repair to Athens in order to enter into alliance and to endeavor to procure support from her. Corinth also, hearing of their intentions, sent an embassy to Athens to prevent the Corcyraean navy being joined by the Athenian, and her prospect of ordering the war according to her wishes being thus impeded. An assembly was convoked, and the rival advocates appeared. The Corcyraeans spoke as follows: Athenians, when people that have not rendered any important service or support to their neighbors in times past, for which they might claim to be repaid, appear before them, as we now appear before you to solicit their assistance, they may fairly be required to satisfy certain preliminary conditions. They should show, first, that it is expedient or at least safe to grant their request. Next, that they will retain a lasting sense of kindness. But if they cannot clearly establish any of these points, they must not be annoyed if they meet with a rebuff. Now, the Corcyraeans believe that with their petition for assistance, they can also give you a satisfactory answer on these points, and they have therefore dispatched us hither. It has so happened that our policy as regards you, with respect to this request, turns out to be inconsistent, and, as regards our interests, to be at the present crisis inexpedient. We say inconsistent, because a power which has never, in the whole of her past history, been willing to ally herself with any of her neighbors, is now found asking them to ally themselves with her. And we say inexpedient, because in our present war with Corinth, it has left us in a position of entire isolation. What once seemed the wise precaution of refusing to involve ourselves in alliances with other powers, lest we should also involve ourselves in risks of their choosing, has now proved to be folly and weakness. It is true that in the late naval engagement we drove back the Corinthians from our shores single-handed, but they have now got together a still larger armament from Peloponnese and the rest of Hellas, and we, seeing our utter inability to cope with them without foreign aid and the magnitude of the danger which subjection to them implies, find it necessary to ask help from you and from every other power. And we hope to be excused if we forswear our old principle of complete political isolation, a principle which was not adopted with any sinister intention, but was rather the consequence of an error in judgment. Now, there are many reasons why, in the event of your compliance, you will congratulate yourselves on this request having been made to you. First, because your assistance will be rendered to a power which, herself inoffensive, is a victim to the injustice of others. Secondly, because all that we value most is at stake in the present contest, and your welcome of us under these circumstances will be a proof of goodwill which will ever keep alive the gratitude you will lay up in our hearts. Thirdly, yourselves accepted, we are the greatest naval power in Hellas. Moreover, can you conceive a stroke of good fortune more rare in itself, or more disheartening to your enemies, than that the power whose adhesion you would have valued above much material and moral strength should present herself self-invited, should deliver herself into your hands without danger and without expense, and should lastly put you in the way of gaining a high character in the eyes of the world, the gratitude of those whom you shall assist, and a great accession of strength for yourselves? You may search all history without finding many instances of a people gaining all these advantages at once, or many instances of a power that comes in quest of assistance being in a position to give to the people whose alliance she solicits as much safety and honor as she will receive. But it will be urged that it is only in the case of a war that we shall be found useful. To this we answer that if any of you imagine that that war is far off, he is grievously mistaken and is blind to the fact that Lacedaemon regards you with jealousy and desires war, and that Corinth is powerful there. The same, remember, that is your enemy, and is even now trying to subdue us as a preliminary to attacking you. And this she does to prevent our becoming united by a common enmity, and her having us both on her hands, and also to ensure getting the start of you in one of two ways, either by crippling our power or by making its strength our own. Now it is our policy to be beforehand with her, that is, for Corcyra to make an offer of alliance, and for you to accept it. In fact, we ought to form plans against her, instead of waiting to defeat the plan she forms against us. If she asserts that for you to receive a colony of hers into an alliance is not right, let her know that every colony that is well treated honors its parent state, but becomes estranged from it by injustice. For colonists are not sent forth on the understanding that they are to be the slaves of those that remain behind, but that they are to be their equals. And that Corinth was injuring us is clear. Invited to refer the dispute about Epidamnus to arbitration, they chose to prosecute their complaints rather than by a fair trial. And let their conduct towards us who are their kin be a warning to you not to be misled by their deceit, nor to yield to their direct requests. Concessions to adversaries only end in self-reproach, and the more strictly they are avoided, the greater will be the chance of security. If it be urged that your reception of us will be a breach of the treaty existing between you and Lacedaemon, the answer is that we are a neutral state, and that one of the express provisions of that treaty is that it shall be competent for any Hellenic state that is neutral to join whichever side it pleases. And it is intolerable for Corinth to be allowed to obtain men for her navy not only from her allies, but also from the rest of Hellas, no small number being furnished by your own subjects, while we're to be excluded both from the alliance left open to us by treaty and from any assistance that we might get from other quarters, and you are to be accused of political immorality if you comply with our request. On the other hand, we shall have much greater cause to complain of you if you do not comply with it. If we, who are in peril and are no enemies of yours, meet with a repulse at your hands, while Corinth, who is the aggressor and your enemy, not only meets with no hindrance from you, but is even allowed to draw material for war from your dependencies. This ought not to be, but you should either forbid her enlisting men in your dominions, or you should lend us too what help you may think advisable. But your real policy is to afford us avowed countenance and support. The advantages of this course, as we premised in the beginning of our speech, are many. We mention one that is perhaps the chief. Could there be a clearer guarantee of our good faith than is offered by the fact that the power which is at enmity with you is also at enmity with us, and that power is fully able to punish defection? And there is a wide difference between declining the alliance of an inland and of a maritime power. Your first endeavor should be to prevent, if possible, the existence of any naval power except your own. Failing this, to secure the friendship of the strongest that does exist. And if any of you believe that what we urge is expedient, but fear to act upon this belief, lest it should lead to a breach of the treaty, you must remember that on the one hand, whatever your fears, your strength will be formidable to your antagonists. On the other, whatever the confidence you derive from refusing to receive us, your weakness will have no terrors for a strong enemy. You must also remember that your decision is for Athens no less than Corcyra, and that you are not making the best provision for her interests, if at a time when you are anxiously scanning the horizon that you may be in readiness for the breaking out of the war, which is all but upon you, you hesitate to attach to your side a place whose adhesion or estrangement is alike pregnant with the most vital consequences. For it lies conveniently for the coast navigation in the direction of Italy and Sicily, being able to bar the passage of naval reinforcements from thence to Peloponnese, and from Peloponnese thither, and it is in other respects a most desirable station. To sum up as shortly as possible, embracing both general and particular considerations, let this show you the folly of sacrificing us. Remember that there are but 3 considerable naval powers in Hellas, Athens, Corcyra, and Corinth, and that if you allow 2 of these 3 to become one, and Corinth to secure us for herself, you will have to hold the sea against the united fleets of Corcyra and Peloponnese. But if you receive us, you will have our ships to reinforce you in the struggle. Such are the words of the Corcyrians. After they had finished, the Corinthians spoke as follows. These Corcyrians, in the speech we have just heard, do not confine themselves to the question of their reception into your alliance. They also talk of our being guilty of injustice, and their being the victims of an unjustifiable war. It becomes necessary for us to touch upon both these points before we proceed to the rest of what we have to say, that you may have a more correct idea of the grounds of our claim, and have good cause to reject their petition. According to them, their old policy of refusing all offers of alliance was a policy of moderation. It was in fact adopted for bad ends, not for good. Indeed, their conduct is such as to make them by no means desirous of having allies present to witness it, or of having the shame of asking their concurrence. Besides, their geographical situation makes them independent of others, and, consequently, the decision in cases where they injure any lies not with judges appointed by mutual agreement, but with themselves. Because, while they seldom make voyages to their neighbors, they are constantly being visited by foreign vessels, which are compelled to put into Corcyra. In short, the object that they propose to themselves, in their specious policy of complete isolation, is not to avoid sharing in the crimes of others, but to secure monopoly of crime to themselves, the license of outrage wherever they can compel, of fraud wherever they can elude, and the enjoyment of their gains without shame. And yet if they were the honest men they pretend to be, the less hold that others had upon them, the stronger would be the light in which they might have put their honesty by giving and taking what was just. But such has not been their conduct, either towards others or towards us. The attitude of our colony towards us has always been one of estrangement, and is now one of hostility. For, say they, mimicking Corcyrian argument, slightly dismissive, we were not sent out to be ill-treated. Returned to Corinthian tone, we rejoin that we did not find the colony to be insulted by them, but to be its head and to be regarded with a proper respect. At any rate, our other colonies honor us, and we are much beloved by our colonists. And clearly, if the majority are satisfied with us, they can have no good reason for a dissatisfaction in which they stand alone, and we're not acting improperly in making war against them, nor are we making war against them without having received signal provocation. Besides, if we were in the wrong, it would be honorable for them to give way to our wishes and disgraceful for us to trample on their moderation. But in the pride and license of wealth they have sinned again and again against us, and never more deeply than when Epidamnus, our dependency, which they took no steps to claim in its distress upon our coming to relieve it, was by them seized, and is now held by force of arms. As to their allegation that they wish the question to be first submitted to arbitration, it is obvious that a challenge coming from the party who is safe in a commanding position cannot gain the credit due only to him who, before appealing to arms, in deeds as well as words, places himself on a level with his adversary. In their case, it was not before they laid siege to the place, but after they at length understood that we should not tamely suffer it, that they thought of the specious word arbitration. And not satisfied with their own misconduct there, they appear here, now requiring you to join with them not in alliance, but in crime, and to receive them in spite of their being in enmity with us. But it was when they stood firmest that they should have made overtures to you, and not at a time when we have been wronged and they are in peril, nor yet at a time when you will be admitting to a share in your protection those who never admitted you to a share in their power, and will be incurring an equal amount of blame from us with those in whose offenses you had no hand. No, they should have shared their power with you before they asked you to share your fortunes with them. So then, the reality of the grievances we come to complain of and the violence and rapacity of our opponents have both been proved, but that you cannot equitably receive them, this you have still to learn. It may be true that one of the provisions of the treaty is that it shall be competent for any state, whose name was not down on the list, to join whichever side it pleases. But this agreement is not meant for those whose object in joining is the injury of other powers, but for those whose need of support does not arise from the fact of defection, and whose adhesion will not bring to the power that is mad enough to receive them war instead of peace, which will be the case with you, if you refuse to listen to us. For you cannot become their auxiliary and remain our friend. If you join in their attack, you must share the punishment which the defenders inflict on them. And yet you have the best possible right to be neutral, or, failing this, you should on the contrary join us against them. Corinth is at least in treaty with you. With Corcyra you were never even in truce. But do not lay down the principle that defection is to be patronized. Did we, on the defection of the Samians, record our vote against you, when the rest of the Peloponnesian powers were equally divided on the question whether they should assist them? No, we told them to their face that every power has a right to punish its own allies. Why? If you make it your policy to receive and assist all offenders, you will find that just as many of your dependencies will come over to us, and the principle that you establish will press less heavily on us than on yourselves. This, then, is what Hellenic law entitles us to demand as a right. But we also have advice to offer and claims on your gratitude, which, since there is no danger of our injuring you, as we are not enemies, and since our friendship does not amount to very frequent intercourse, we say ought to be liquidated at the present juncture. When you were in want of ships of war for the war against the Aeginetans, before the Persian invasion, Corinth supplied you with 20 vessels. That good turn, and the line we took on the Samian question, when we were the cause of the Peloponnesians refusing to assist them, enabled you to conquer Aegina and to punish Samos. And we acted thus at crises when, if ever, men are wont in their efforts against their enemies to forget everything for the sake of victory, regarding him who assists them then as a friend, even if thus far he has been a foe, and him who opposes them then as a foe, even if he has thus far been a friend. Indeed, they allow their real interests to suffer from their absorbing preoccupation in the struggle. Weigh these considerations well, and let your youth learn what they are from their elders, and let them determine to do unto us as we have done unto you. And let them not acknowledge the justice of what we say, but dispute its wisdom in the contingency of war. Not only is the straightest path, generally speaking, the wisest, but the coming of the war, which the Corcyraeans have used as a bugbear to persuade you to do wrong, is still uncertain, and it is not worthwhile to be carried away by it into gaining the instant and declared enmity of Corinth. It was, rather, wise to try and counteract the unfavorable impression which your conduct to Megara has created. For kindness opportunely shown has a greater power of removing old grievances than the facts of the case may warrant. And do not be seduced by the prospect of a great naval alliance. Abstinence from all injustice to other first-rate powers is a greater tower of strength than anything that can be gained by the sacrifice of permanent tranquility for an apparent temporary advantage. It is now our turn to benefit by the principle that we laid down at Lacedaemon, that every power has a right to punish her own allies. We now claim to receive the same from you, and protest against your rewarding us for benefiting you by our vote by injuring us by yours. On the contrary, return us like for like, remembering that this is that very crisis in which he who lends aid is most a friend, and he who opposes is most a foe. And for these Corcyraeans, neither receive them into alliance in our despite, nor be their abettors in crime. So do, and you will act as we have a right to expect of you, and at the same time best consult your own interests. Such were the words of the Corinthians. When the Athenians had heard both out, 2 assemblies were held. In the first, there was a manifest disposition to listen to the representations of Corinth. In the second, public feeling had changed, and an alliance with Corcyra was decided on, with certain reservations. It was to be a defensive, not an offensive alliance. It did not involve a breach of the treaty with Peloponnese. Athens could not be required to join Corcyra in any attack upon Corinth. But each of the contracting parties had a right to the other's assistance against invasion, whether of his own territory or that of an ally. For it began now to be felt that the coming of the Peloponnesian War was only a question of time, and no one was willing to see a naval power of such magnitude as Corcyra sacrificed to Corinth. Though if they could let them weaken each other by mutual conflict, it would be no bad preparation for the struggle which Athens might one day have to wage with Corinth and the other naval powers. At the same time, the islands seemed to lie conveniently on the coasting passage to Italy and Sicily. With these views, Athens received Corcyra into alliance and, on the departure of the Corinthians not long afterwards, sent 10 ships to their assistance. They were commanded by Lacedaemonius, the son of Cimon, Diotimus, the son of Strombichus, and Proteas, the son of Epicles. Their instructions were to avoid collision with the Corinthian fleet except under certain circumstances. If it sailed to Corcyra and threatened a landing on her coast, or in any of her possessions, they were to do their utmost to prevent it. These instructions were prompted by an anxiety to avoid a breach of the treaty. Meanwhile, the Corinthians completed their preparations and sailed for Corcyra with 150 ships. Of these, Elis furnished 10, Megara 12, Leucas 10, Ambracia 27, Anactorium 1, and Corinth herself 90. Each of these contingents had its own admiral, the Corinthian being under the command of Xenoclides, son of Euthicles, with 4 colleagues. Sailing from Leucas, they made land at the part of the continent opposite Corcyra. They anchored in the harbor of Chimerium, in the territory of Thesprotis, above which, at some distance from the sea, lies the city of Ephyre, in the Elean district. By this city the Acherusian lake pours its waters into the sea. It gets its name from the river Acheron, which flows through Thesprotis and falls into the lake. There also the river Thymus flows, forming the boundary between Thesprotis and Kestrine, and between these rivers rises the point of Chimerium. In this part of the continent, the Corinthians now came to anchor and formed an encampment. When the Corcyraeans saw them coming, they manned 110 ships, commanded by Mykiades, Isamides, and Eurybatus, and stationed themselves at one of the Sabota Isles, the 10 Athenian ships being present. On Point Lukim, they posted their land forces and 1,000 heavy infantry who had come from Zacynthus to their assistance. Nor were the Corinthians on the mainland without their allies. The barbarians flocked in large numbers to their assistance, the inhabitants of this part of the continent being old allies of theirs. When the Corinthian preparations were completed, they took 3 days' provisions and set sail from Chimerium by night, ready for action. With the dawn, they sighted the Corcyraean fleet out at sea, approaching them. As both sides perceived each other, they immediately formed into battle order. On the Corcyraean right wing lay the Athenian ships, while the rest of their line was occupied by Corcyraean vessels, formed in 3 squadrons, each commanded by one of their 3 admirals. That was the Corcyraean formation. The Corinthian formation was as follows. On the right wing lay the Megarian and Ambraciot ships. In the center, the rest of their allies in order. But the left wing was composed of the best sailors in the Corinthian navy, positioned to engage the Athenians and the Corcyraean right wing. As soon as the signals were raised on either side, they joined the battle. Both fleets carried a large number of heavy infantry on their decks, along with many archers and javelin throwers. The old, less sophisticated armament still prevailed. The sea fight was an obstinate one, though not remarkable for its naval strategy. Indeed, it resembled more a battle fought on land. Whenever they charged each other, the sheer number and crush of vessels made it difficult to disengage. Moreover, their hopes of victory rested principally on the heavy infantry on the decks, who stood and fought in formation, their ships remaining relatively stationary. The maneuver of breaking the enemy line was not attempted. In short, brute strength and courage had a greater share in the fight than tactical science. Everywhere, tumult reigned. The battle was a scene of utter confusion. Meanwhile, the Athenian ships, by coming up to assist the Corcyraeans whenever they were pressed, served to alarm the enemy. Still, their commanders, fearing their instructions, could not fully join the battle. The right wing of the Corinthians suffered most. The Corcyraeans routed it, chasing them in disorder to the mainland with 20 ships. They sailed up to the Corinthian camp, burned the empty tents they found, and plundered their supplies. So, in this quarter, the Corinthians and their allies were defeated, and the Corcyraeans were victorious. But where the Corinthians themselves were, on the left wing, they gained a decided success. The already scanty Corcyraean forces were further weakened by the absence of the 20 ships engaged in the pursuit. Seeing the Corcyraeans hard-pressed, the Athenians at last began to assist them more unequivocally. At first, it's true, they refrained from directly charging any ships. But as the rout became undeniable and the Corinthians pressed on, the time finally came when all restraint was laid aside. It reached the point where Corinthians and Athenians openly raised their hands against each other. After the rout, the Corinthians, instead of securing the hulls of the disabled vessels, focused their attention on the men. They butchered them as they sailed through, caring less to take prisoners. Some of their own friends were even mistakenly slain due to their ignorance of the defeat on their right wing. The sheer number of ships on both sides and the vast area they covered at sea made it difficult, once engaged, to distinguish between the victorious and the vanquished. This battle proved far greater than any before it, at least between Hellenes, in terms of the number of vessels involved. After chasing the Corcyraeans to the land, the Corinthians turned to the wrecks and their dead, most of whom they succeeded in recovering and conveying to Sabota. Sabota was the rendezvous point for the land forces provided by their barbarian allies, a deserted harbor in Thesprotis. This task completed, They mustered anew and sailed against the Corcyraeans, who, for their part, advanced to meet them with all their remaining seaworthy ships, accompanied by the Athenian vessels. They feared the Corinthians might attempt a landing in their territory. It was by this time getting late, and the battle hymn had already been sung for the attack, when the Corinthians suddenly began to back water. They had observed 20 Athenian ships sailing up, sent as reinforcements after the initial 10, as the Athenians, rightly as it turned out, feared the defeat of the Corcyraeans and the inability of their small number of ships to protect them. These new ships were seen by the Corinthians first. They suspected they were from Athens, and that those sighted were not all, but that more were still behind them. Accordingly, they began to retire. The Corcyraeans, meanwhile, had not sighted them, as the reinforcements were advancing from a less visible point. They wondered why the Corinthians were backing water, when some suddenly caught sight of them and cried out that ships were visible ahead. Upon this, the Corcyraeans also retired. It was now getting dark, and the Corinthian retreat had suspended hostilities. Thus they parted from each other, and the battle ceased with nightfall. The Corcyraeans were in their camp at Lucium when these 20 ships from Athens, under the command of Glaucon, son of Ligarus, and Andocides, son of Leogoras, sailed through the corpses and wrecks and reached the camp, not long after they had been sighted. It was now night, and the Corcyraeans initially feared they might be hostile vessels. But they soon recognized them, and the ships came to anchor. The next day, the 30 Athenian vessels put out to sea, accompanied by all the Corcyraean ships that were seaworthy, and sailed to the harbor at Sabota, where the Corinthians lay, to see if they would engage. The Corinthians put out from the land and formed a line in the open sea, but made no further movement. They had no intention of taking the offensive, for they saw fresh reinforcements arriving from Athens and faced numerous difficulties themselves, such as guarding the prisoners they had on board and the lack of means to refit their ships in a deserted place. What they worried about most was how their voyage home would be affected. They feared the Athenians might consider the treaty dissolved by the collision that had occurred and forbid their departure. Accordingly, they resolved to put some men aboard a boat and send them to the Athenians without a herald's wand as a test. You do wrong, Athenians, to begin war and break the treaty. Engaged in chastising our enemies, we find you placing yourselves in our path, in arms against us. Now, if your intentions are to prevent us sailing to Corcyra or anywhere else that we may wish, and if you are for breaking the treaty, first take us that are here and treat us as enemies. Such was what they said, and all the Corcyraean forces within hearing immediately called out to take them and kill them. Neither are we beginning war, Peloponnesians, nor are we breaking the treaty. But these Corcyraeans are our allies, and we are coming to help them. So if you want to sail anywhere else, we place no obstacle in your way. But if you are going to sail against Corcyra or any of her possessions, we shall do our best to stop you. Receiving this answer from the Athenians, the Corinthians commenced preparations for their voyage home and set up a trophy in Sabota on the mainland. Meanwhile, the Corcyraeans took up the wrecks and dead that had been carried out to them by the current and by a wind which rose in the night, scattering them in all directions, and set up their trophy in Sabota on the island as victors. The reasons each side had for claiming victory were these. The Corinthians had been victorious in the sea fight until night. Having thus been able to carry off most of the wrecks and dead, they were in possession of no fewer than 1,000 prisoners of war, and had sunk close upon 70 vessels. The Corcyraeans had destroyed about 30 ships, and after the arrival of the Athenians had taken up the wrecks and dead on their side. They had, besides, seen the Corinthians retire before them, backing water at the sight of the Athenian vessels, and upon the arrival of the Athenians, refusing to sail out against them from Sybota. Thus, both sides claimed victory. On the voyage home, the Corinthians took Anactorium, which stands at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf. The place was taken by treachery, being common ground to the Corcyraeans and Corinthians. After establishing Corinthian settlers there, they retired home. 800 of the Corcyraeans were made slaves and sold. 250 they were retained in captivity and treated with great attention, in the hope that they might persuade their country to align with Corinth upon their return. Most of them were, as it happened, men of very high position in Corcyra. In this way, Corcyra maintained her political existence in the war with Corinth, and the Athenian vessels left the island. This was the first cause of the war that Corinth had against the Athenians, but they had fought against them with the Corcyraeans during a time of treaty. Almost immediately after this, fresh differences arose between the Athenians and Peloponnesians and contributed their share to the war. Corinth was forming schemes for retaliation, and Athens suspected her hostility. The Potidæans, who inhabited the Isthmus of Pallene, though a Corinthian colony, were tributary allies of Athens. They were ordered to raise the wall looking towards Pallene, to give hostages, to dismiss the Corinthian magistrates, and in the future, not to receive the persons sent annually from Corinth to succeed them. It was feared that they might be persuaded by Perdiccas and the Corinthians to revolt and might draw the rest of the allies in the Thracian region to revolt with them. These precautions against the Potidæans were taken by the Athenians immediately after the battle at Corcyra. Not only was Corinth at length openly hostile, but Perdiccas, son of Alexander, king of the Macedonians, had, from an old friend and ally, been made an enemy. He had been made an enemy by the Athenians entering into alliance with his brother Philip and Dirdas, who were allied against him. In his alarm, he had been sent to Lacedaemon to try and involve the Athenians in a war with the Peloponnesians, and was endeavoring to win over Corinth in order to bring about the revolt of Potidæa. He also made overtures to the Chalcidians in the region of Thrace and to the Bottians to persuade them to join in the revolt. For he thought that if these border towns could be made his allies, it would be easier to carry on the war with their cooperation. Alive to all this, and wishing to anticipate the revolt of the cities, the Athenians acted as follows. They were just then sending off 30 ships and 1,000 heavy infantry for his country under the command of Archestratus, son of Lycomedes, with 4 colleagues. They instructed the captains to take hostages from the Potidæans, to raise the wall, and to be on their guard against the revolt of the neighboring cities. Meanwhile, the Potidæans sent envoys to Athens on the chance of persuading them to take no new steps in their affairs. They also went to Lacedaemon with the Corinthians to secure support in case of need. Failing, after prolonged negotiation, to obtain anything satisfactory from the Athenians, unable, for all they could say, to prevent the vessels destined for Macedonia from also sailing against them, and receiving from the Lacedaemonian government a promise to invade Attica if the Athenians should attack Potidæa. The Potidæans, thus favored by the moment, at last entered into league with the Alcidians and Bottians and revolted. And Perdiccas induced the Chalcidians to abandon and demolish their towns on the seaboard and, settling inland at Olynthus, to make that one city a strong place. Meanwhile, to those who followed his advice, he gave a part of his territory in Mygdonia, around Lake Balbe, as a place of abode while the war against the Athenians should last. They accordingly demolished their towns, removed inland, and prepared for war. The 30 ships of the Athenians, arriving before the Thracian places, found Potidæa and the rest in revolt. Their commanders, considering it quite impossible with their present force to carry on war with Perdiccas and with the Confederate towns as well, turned to Macedonia, their original destination. Having established themselves there, they carried on war in cooperation with Philip and the brothers of Dirdas, who had invaded the country from the interior. Meanwhile, the Corinthians, with Potidaea in revolt and the Athenian ships on the coast of Macedonia, were alarmed for the safety of Potidaea, considering its danger their own. They sent volunteers from Corinth and mercenaries from the rest of the Peloponnese, numbering 1,600 heavy infantry in all and 400 light troops. Aristeus, son of Adamantus, who was always a steady friend to the Potidaeans, took command of the expedition, and it was principally for love of him that most of the men from Corinth volunteered. They arrived in Thrace 40 days after the revolt of Potidaea. The Athenians also immediately received news of the revolt of the cities. On being informed that Aristeus and his reinforcements were on their way, they sent 2,000 heavy infantry of their own citizens and 40 ships against the revolting places under the command of Callias, son of Calliades, and 4 colleagues. They arrived in Macedonia first and found a force of 1,000 men that had been initially sent out, now masters of Therme and besieging Pydna. Accordingly, they also joined in the investment and besieged Pydna for a while. Subsequently, they came to terms and concluded a forced alliance with Perdiccas, hastened by the calls from Potidaea and by the arrival of Aristeus at that place. They withdrew from Macedonia, going to Beroea and thence to Strepsa, and after a futile attempt on the latter place, they pursued their march by land to Potidaea with 3,000 heavy infantry of their own citizens, besides a number of their allies, and 600 Macedonian horsemen, the followers of Philip and Pausanias. With these sailed 70 ships along the coast. Advancing by short marches, on the 3rd day they arrived at Gigonus, where they encamped. Meanwhile, the Potidaeans and the Peloponnesians with Aristeus were encamped on the side, looking towards Olynthus on the isthmus, in expectation of the Athenians, and had established their market outside the city. The allies had chosen Aristeus general of all the infantry, while command of the cavalry was given to Perdiccas, who had at once left the alliance of the Athenians and gone back to that of the Potidaeans, having deputed Iolaus as his general. The plan of Aristeus was to keep his own force on the isthmus and await the attack of the Athenians, leaving the Chalcidians and the allies outside the isthmus, and the 200 cavalry from Perdiccas and Olynthus to act upon the Athenian rear when they advanced against him, thus placing the enemy between 2 fires, while Callias, the Athenian general, and his colleagues dispatched the Macedonian horse and a few of the allies to Olynthus. To prevent any movement from that quarter, the Athenians themselves broke up their camp and marched against Potidaea. After they arrived at the isthmus and saw the enemy preparing for battle, they formed against him, and soon afterwards engaged. The wing of Aristeus, with the Corinthians and other picked troops around him, routed the wing opposed to it, and followed for a considerable distance in pursuit. But the rest of the army of the Potidaeans and of the Peloponnesians was defeated by the Athenians and took refuge within the fortifications. Returning from the pursuit, Aristeus perceived the defeat of the rest of the army. Being at a loss of which of the 2 risks to choose, whether to go to Olynthus or to Potidaea, he at last determined to draw his men into as small a space as possible and force his way with a run into Potidaea. Not without difficulty, through a storm of missiles, he passed along by the breakwater through the sea and brought off most of his men safely, though a few were lost. Meanwhile, the auxiliaries of the Potidaeans from Olynthus, which is about 7 miles off and in sight of Potidaea, when the battle began and the signals were raised, advanced a little way to render assistance, and the Macedonian horse formed against them to prevent it. But on victory speedily declaring for the Athenians, and the signals being taken down, they retired back within the wall, and the Macedonians returned to the Athenians. Thus, There were no cavalry present on either side. After the battle, the Athenians set up a trophy and gave back their dead to the Potidæans under truce. The Potidæans and their allies had close to 300 killed. The Athenians lost 150 of their own citizens and Callias, their general. The wall on the side of the isthmus had now been quickly raised against it and manned by the Athenians. That on the side of Pellene had no works raised against it. They did not think themselves strong enough at once to keep a garrison on the isthmus and to cross over to Pellene and raise works there. They were afraid that the Potidæans and their allies might take advantage of their division to attack them. Meanwhile, the Athenians at home, learning that there were no works at Pellene, sometime afterwards sent off 1,600 heavy infantry of their own citizens under the command of Phormio, son of Asopius. Arriving at Pellene, he fixed his headquarters at Aphitus and led his army against Potidæa by short marches, ravaging the country as he advanced. With no one venturing to meet him in the field, he raised works against the wall on the side of Pellene. So at length Potidæa was strongly invested on either side, and from the sea by the ships cooperating in the blockade. Aristeus, seeing its investment complete, and having no hope of its salvation except in the event of some movement from the Peloponnese or some other improbable contingency, advised all but 500 to watch for a favorable wind and sail out of the place, in order that their provisions might last longer. He was willing to be one of those who remained, unable to persuade them, and desirous of acting on the next best alternative and having things outside in the best possible posture. He eluded the guardships of the Athenians and sailed out. Remaining among the Chalcidians, he continued to carry on the war. In particular, he laid an ambush near the city of the Sermilians and cut off many of them. He also communicated with the Peloponnese and tried to contrive some method by which help might be brought. Meanwhile, after the completion of the investment of Potidæa, Phormio next employed his 1,600 men in ravaging Chalcidice and Boeotia. Some of the towns also were taken by him. Chapter 3. The Athenians and Peloponnesians held these complaints against each other from the outset. Corinth's grievance was that her colony of Potidæa, containing Corinthian and Peloponnesian citizens, was under siege. Athens, in turn, complained that the Peloponnesians had incited one of her allied towns, a contributor to her revenue, to revolt. They had come, openly fighting alongside the Potidæans against her. Despite all this, war had not yet truly broken out. A truce still held for a while, as this was at first a private Corinthian venture. However, the siege of Potidæa put an end to Corinth's inaction. She had men inside the city and feared greatly for its fate. Immediately, she summoned her allies to Lacedaemon. There, she vehemently accused Athens of breaching the treaty and violating the rights of the Peloponnesians. With her, the Aeginetans, though officially unrepresented due to their fear of Athens, secretly proved to be among the most urgent advocates for war. They asserted that they lacked the independence guaranteed to them by the treaty. After extending the summons to any other allies or states with grievances against Athenian aggression, the Lacedaemonians held their regular assembly and invited them to speak. Many came forward with various accusations. Among them, the Megarians, with a long list of grievances, drew special attention to their exclusion from the ports of the Athenian Empire and the market of Athens, a clear defiance of the treaty. Last of all, the Corinthians stepped forward. Having allowed those who spoke before them to inflame the Lacedaemonians, they now followed with a speech to this effect. Lacedaemonians, the confidence you feel in your constitution and social order makes you view our reflections on other powers with a certain skepticism. This creates your moderation, but it also reveals your rather limited understanding when dealing with foreign politics. Time and again, Our voice was raised to warn you of the blows Athens was about to inflict upon us, and time and again. Instead of troubling yourselves to ascertain the truth of our communications, you contented yourselves with suspecting that the speakers were motivated by private interest. And so, instead of calling these allies together before the blow fell, you delayed until we are now smarting under it. Among these allies, we have the strongest claim to speak, having the greatest complaints of Athenian outrage and Lacedaemonian neglect. Now, if these assaults on the rights of Greece have been made in secret, you might be unaware of the facts, and it would be our duty to enlighten you. As it is, long speeches are not needed. You yourselves see servitude accomplished for some of us, and meditated for others, especially for our allies, along with the aggressor's prolonged preparations for war. What, pray, is the meaning of their receiving Corcyra by deception and holding it against us by force? What the siege of Potidæa? These are places, one of which lies most conveniently for any action against the Thracian towns, while the other would have contributed a very large navy to the Peloponnesians. For all this, you are responsible. You were the ones who first allowed them to fortify their city after the Median War, and later to erect the Long Walls. You who, then and now, are always depriving of freedom not only those whom they have enslaved, but also those who are still your allies. For the true author of a people's subjugation is not so much the immediate agent, but the power which permits it, having the means to prevent it. This is especially true if that power aspires to the glory of being the liberator of Greece. We are at last assembled. It has not been easy to gather, nor even now are our objectives clearly defined. We ought not to be still inquiring into the fact of our wrongs, but into the means of our defense. For the aggressors, with their matured plans to counter our indecision, have cast aside threats and turned to action. And we know the paths by which Athenian aggression travels, and how insidious its progress is. A degree of confidence they may feel, believing your bluntness of perception prevents your noticing them. But this is nothing compared to the impulse their advance will receive from the knowledge that you see, but do not care to interfere. You, Lacedaemonians, of all the Hellenes, are alone inactive. You defend yourselves not by doing anything, but by looking as if you would do something. You alone wait until the power of an enemy becomes twice its original size, instead of crushing it in its infancy. And yet, the world used to say that you were to be depended upon. But in your case, we fear it said more than the truth. The Mede, we ourselves know, had time to come from the ends of the earth to the Peloponnese, without any force of yours worthy of the name advancing to meet him. But this was a distant enemy. Well, Athens, at all events, is a near neighbor, and yet Athens you utterly disregard. Against Athens, you prefer to act on the defensive instead of on the offensive, and to make it an affair of chances by deferring the struggle until she has grown far stronger than at first. And yet you know that, on the whole, the rock on which the barbarian was wrecked was himself. And if our present enemy, Athens, has not again and again annihilated us, we owe it more to her blunders than to your protection. Indeed, expectations from you have before now been the ruin of some, whose faith induced them to omit preparation. We hope that none of you will consider these words of remonstrance to be words of hostility. Men remonstrate with friends who are in error, accusations they reserve for enemies who have wronged them. Besides, we consider that we have as good a right as anyone to point out a neighbor's faults, particularly when we contemplate the great contrast between our two national characters, a contrast of which, as far as we can see, you have little perception of. You have never truly considered what sort of antagonists you will encounter in the Athenians, how widely, how absolutely different from yourselves. The Athenians are addicted to innovation, and their designs are characterized by swiftness alike in conception and execution. You, however, have a genius for keeping what you have, accompanied by a total want of invention. And when forced to act, you never go far enough. Again, they are adventurous beyond their power and daring beyond their judgment. In danger, they are sanguine. Your habit is to attempt less than is justified by your power, to mistrust even what is sanctioned by your judgment, and to fancy that from danger there is no release. Furthermore, there is promptness on their side against procrastination on yours. They are never at home. You are never away from it. For they hope by their absence to extend their acquisitions. You fear by your advance to endanger what you have left behind. They are swift to follow up a success and slow to recoil from a reverse. Their bodies they spend ungrudgingly in their country's cause. Their intellect they jealously husband to be employed in her service. A scheme unexecuted is with them a positive loss, a successful enterprise, a comparative failure. The deficiency created by a miscarriage of an undertaking is soon filled up by fresh hopes. For they alone are enabled to call a thing hoped for, by the speed with which they act upon their resolutions. Thus they toil on in trouble and danger all the days of their life, with little opportunity for enjoying, being ever engaged in getting. Their only idea of a holiday is to do what the occasion demands. And to them, laborious occupation is less of a misfortune than the peace of a quiet life. To describe their character in a word, one might truly say that they were born into the world to take no rest themselves and to give none to others. Such is Athens, your antagonist. And yet, Lacedaemonians, you still delay. You fail to see that peace stays longest with those who are not merely careful to use their power justly, but also determined not to submit to injustice. On the contrary, your ideal of fair dealing is based on the principle that if you do not injure others, you need not risk your own fortunes in preventing others from injuring you. Now, you could scarcely have succeeded in such a policy, even with a neighbor like yourselves. But in the present instance, as we have just shown, your habits are old-fashioned compared to theirs. It is the law, in art as in politics, that improvements ever prevail. And though fixed usages may be best for undisturbed communities, constant necessities of action must be accompanied by the constant improvement of methods. Thus it happens that the vast experience of Athens has carried her further than you on the path of innovation. Here, at least, let your procrastination end. For the present, assist your allies, and Potidaea in particular, as you promised, by a speedy invasion of Attica. Do not sacrifice friends and kindred to their bitterest enemies, and drive the rest of us in despair to some other alliance. Such a step would not be condemned either by the gods who received our oaths, or by the men who witnessed them. The breach of a treaty cannot be laid to the people whose desertion compels them to seek new relations, but to the power that fails to assist its confederate. But if you will only act, we will stand by you. It would be unnatural for us to change, and never should we meet with such a congenial ally. For these reasons, choose the right course. Endeavor not to let the Peloponnese, under your supremacy, degenerate from the prestige it enjoyed under that of your ancestors. Such were the words of the Corinthians. There happened to be Athenian envoys present at Lacedaemon on other business. On hearing these speeches, they felt compelled to address the Lacedaemonians. Their intention was not to offer a defense against any specific charges the cities brought against them, but to show, from a comprehensive view, that this was not a matter to be hastily decided, but one that demanded further consideration. They also wished to call attention to the great power of Athens, and to refresh the memory of the old while enlightening the ignorance of the young, with the notion that their words might induce them to prefer tranquility to war. So, they came to the Lacedaemonians and stated that they, too, if there was no objection, wished to speak to their assembly. The Lacedaemonians replied by inviting them to come forward. The Athenians advanced and spoke as follows. The object of our mission here was not to argue with your allies, but to attend to the matters on which our state dispatched us. However, the vehemence of the outcry we hear against us has prevailed upon us to come forward. It is not to combat the accusations of the cities. Indeed, you are not the judges before whom either we or they can plead, but to prevent your taking the wrong course on matters of great importance by yielding too readily to the persuasions of your allies. We also wish to show, upon a review of the whole indictment, that we have a fair title to our possessions and that our country has claims to consideration. We need not refer to remote antiquity, that we could appeal to the voice of tradition, but not to the experience of our audience. But to the Median War and contemporary history we must refer, although we are rather tired of continually bringing this subject forward. In our actions during that war, we ran great risk to obtain certain advantages. You had your share in the solid results. Do not try to rob us of all share in the good, that the glory may due us. However, the story shall be told not so much to deprecate hostility as to testify against it, and to show, if you are so ill-advised as to enter into a struggle with Athens, what sort of an antagonist she is likely to prove. We assert that at Marathon, we were at the front and faced the barbarian single-handed. When he came the second time, unable to cope with him by land, we went on board our ships with all our people and joined in the action at Salamis. This prevented him from taking the Peloponnesian states in detail and ravaging them with his fleet, when the multitude of his vessels would have made any combination for self-defense impossible. The best proof of this was furnished by the invader himself. Defeated at sea, he considered his power to be no longer what it had been, and retired as speedily as possible with the greater part of his army. We assert, therefore, that we conferred on you quite as much as we received, for you had a stake to fight for. The cities which you had left were still filled with your homes, and you had the prospect of enjoying them again. And your coming was prompted quite as much by fear for yourselves as for us. At all events, you never appeared until we had nothing left to lose. But we left behind us a city that was a city no longer, and staked our lives for a city that had an existence only in desperate hope. And so, we bore our full share in your deliverance and in ours. But if we had copied others and allowed fears for our territory to make us give in our adhesion to the Mede before you came, or if we had suffered our ruin to break our spirit and prevent us embarking in our ships, your naval inferiority would have made a sea fight unnecessary, and his objects would have been peaceably attained. Surely, Lacedaemonians, neither by the patriotism that we displayed at that crisis, nor by the wisdom of our counsels, do we merit our extreme unpopularity with the Hellenes. Not, at least, unpopularity for our empire. That empire we acquired by no violent means, but because you were unwilling to prosecute to its conclusion the war against the barbarian, and because the allies attached themselves to us and spontaneously asked us to assume the command. And the nature of the case first compelled us to advance our empire to its present height, fear being our principal motive, though honor and interest afterwards came in. And at last, when almost all hated us, when some had already revolted and had been subdued, when you had ceased to be the friends that you once were, and had become objects of suspicion and dislike, it appeared no longer safe to give up our empire, especially as all who left us would fall to you. And no one can quarrel with a people for making, in matters of tremendous risk, the best provision that it can for its interest. You, at all events, Lacedaemonians, have used your supremacy to settle the states in the Peloponnese as is agreeable to you. And if, at the period of which we were speaking, you had persevered to the end and had incurred hatred in your command, we are sure that you would have made yourselves just as galling to the allies. You would have been forced to choose between a strong government and danger to yourselves. It follows that it was not a very wonderful action, or contrary to the common practice of humankind, if we did accept an empire that was offered to us and refused to give it up under the pressure of three of the strongest motives: fear, honor, and interest. And it was not we who set the example, for it has always been law that the weaker should be subject to the stronger. Besides, we believed ourselves to be worthy of our position, and so you thought us until now, when calculations of interest have made you take up the cry of justice, a consideration which no one ever yet brought forward to hinder his ambition when he had a chance of gaining anything by might. And praise is due to all who, if not so superior to human nature as to refuse dominion, yet respect justice more than their position compels them to do. We imagine that our moderation would be best demonstrated by the conduct of others who should be placed in our position. But even our equity has very unreasonably subjected us to condemnation instead of approval. Our abatement of our rights in the contract trials with our allies, and our causing them to be decided by impartial laws at Athens, have gained us the character of being litigious, and none care to inquire why this reproach is not brought against other imperial powers, who treat their subjects with less moderation than we do. The secret being that where force can be used, law is not needed. But our subjects are so accustomed to associate with us as equals that any defeat, whatever that clashes with their notions of justice, whether it proceed from a legal judgment or from the power which our empire gives us, makes them forget to be grateful for being allowed to retain most of their possessions. They are more vexed at a part being taken than if we had from the first cast law aside and openly gratified our covetousness. If we had done so, not even would they have disputed that the weaker must give way to the stronger. Men's indignation, it seems, is more excited by legal wrong than by violent wrong. The first looks like being cheated by an equal, the second, like being compelled by a superior. At all events, they contrive to put up with much worse treatment than this from the Mede, yet they think our rule is severe. And this is to be expected, for the present always weighs heavy on the conquered. This, at least, is certain. If you were to succeed in overthrowing us and in taking our place, you would speedily lose the popularity with which fear of us has invested you. This would happen if your policy of today is at all to tally with the sample that you gave of it during the brief period of your command against the Mede. Not only is your life at home regulated by rules and institutions incompatible with those of others, but your citizens abroad act neither on these rules nor on those which are recognized by the rest of Greece. Take time, then, in forming your resolution, as the matter is of great importance. And do not be persuaded by the opinions and complaints of others to bring trouble on yourselves. But consider the vast influence of accidents in war before you are engaged in it. As it continues, it generally becomes an affair of chances, chances from which neither of us is exempt, and whose event we must risk in the dark. It is a common mistake in going to war to begin at the wrong end, to act first and wait for disaster to discuss the matter. But we are not yet by any means so misguided, nor, so far as we can see, are you. Accordingly, while it is still open to us both to choose aright, we bid you not to dissolve the treaty or to break your oaths, but to have our differences settled by arbitration according to our agreement. Or else we take the gods who heard the oaths to witness. And if you begin hostilities, whatever line of action you choose, we will try not to be behindhand in repelling you. Such are the words of the Athenians. After the Lacedaemonians had heard the complaints of the allies against the Athenians and the observations of the Athenians themselves, they all withdrew and consulted by themselves on the question before them. The opinions of the majority all led to the same conclusion. The Athenians were open aggressors, and war must be declared at once. But Archidamus, the Lacedaemonian king, came forward. He had the reputation of being at once a wise and a moderate man, and made the following speech. I have not lived so long, Lacedaemonians, without having had the experience of many wars. And I see those among you of the same age as myself, who will not fall into the common misfortune of longing for war from inexperience or from a belief in its advantage and its safety. This war, on which you're now debating, would be one of the greatest magnitude on a sober consideration of the matter. In a struggle with Peloponnesians and neighbors, our strength is of the same character, and it is possible to move swiftly on the different points. But a struggle with a people who live in a distant land, who also have an extraordinary familiarity with the sea, and who are in the highest state of preparation in every other department, with wealth private and public, with ships and horses and heavy infantry, and a population such as no other Hellenic place can equal, and lastly, a number of tributary allies. What can justify us in rashly beginning such a struggle? Wherein is our trust that we should rush on it unprepared? Is it in our ships? There we are inferior. While if we are to practice and become a match for them, time must intervene. Is it in our money? There we have a far greater deficiency. We neither have it in our treasury, nor are we ready to contribute it from our private funds. Confidence might possibly be felt in our superiority in heavy infantry and population, which will enable us to invade and devastate their lands. But the Athenians have plenty of other land in their empire and can import what they want by sea. Again, if we're to attempt an insurrection of their allies, these will have to be supported with a fleet, most of them being islanders. What then is to be our war? For unless we can either beat them at sea or deprive them of the revenues which feed their navy, we shall meet with little but disaster. Meanwhile, our honor will be pledged to keeping on, particularly if it be the opinion that we began the quarrel. For let us never be elated by the fatal hope of the war being quickly ended by the devastation of their lands. I rather fear that we may leave it as a legacy to our children. So improbable is it that the Athenian spirit will be the slave of their land, or Athenian experience be cowed by war. Not that I would bid you be so unfeeling as to suffer them to injure your allies, and to refrain from unmasking their intrigues. But I do bid you not to take up arms at once, but to send and remonstrate with them in a tone not too suggestive of war, nor again too suggestive of submission, and to employ the interval in perfecting our own preparations. The means will be, first, the acquisition of allies, Hellenic or barbarian, it matters not, so long as they are an accession to our strength, naval or pecuniary. I say Hellenic or barbarian, because the odium of such an accession to all who, like us, are the objects of the designs of the Athenians, is taken away by the law of self-preservation. And secondly, the development of our home resources. If they listen to our embassy, so much the better. But if not, after the lapse of 2 or 3 years, our position will have become materially strengthened, and we can then attack them if we think proper. Perhaps by that time, the sight of our preparations, backed by language equally significant, will have disposed them to submission, while their land is still untouched, and while their counsels may be directed to the retention of advantages as yet undestroyed. For the only light in which you can view their land is that of a hostage in your hands, a hostage the more valuable, the better it is cultivated. This you ought to spare as long as possible, and not make them desperate, and so increase the difficulty of dealing with them. For if, while still unprepared, hurried away by the complaints of our allies, we are induced to lay it waste, have a care that we do not bring deep disgrace and deep perplexity upon the Peloponnese. Complaints, whether of communities or individuals, it is possible to adjust, but war undertaken by a coalition for sectional interests, whose progress there is no means of foreseeing, does not easily admit creditable settlement. And none need think it cowardice for a number of confederates to pause before they attack a single city. The Athenians have allies as numerous as our own, and allies that pay tribute. And war is a matter not so much of arms as of money, which makes arms of use. And this is more than ever true in a struggle between a continental and a maritime power. First, then, let's provide money and not allow ourselves to be carried away by the talk of our allies before we have done so. As we shall have the largest share of responsibility for the consequences, be they good or bad, we have also a right to a tranquil inquiry respecting them. In the slowness and procrastination, the parts of our character that are most assailed by their criticism need not make you blush. If we undertake the war without preparation, we should, by hastening its commencement, only delay its conclusion. Furthermore, a free and a famous city has through all time been ours. The quality which they condemn is really nothing but a wise moderation. Thanks to its possession, we alone do not become insolent in success and give way less than others in misfortune. We are not carried away by the pleasure of hearing ourselves cheered on to risks which our judgment condemns. Nor, if annoyed, are we any the more convinced by attempts to exasperate us by accusation. We are both warlike and wise, and it is our sense of order that makes us so. We are warlike because self-control contains honor as a chief constituent and honor bravery. And we are wise because we are educated with too little learning to despise the laws and with too severe a self-control to disobey them. We are brought up not to be too knowledgeable in useless matters, such as the knowledge which can give a specious criticism of an enemy's plans in theory, but fails to assail them with equal success in practice. But we are taught to consider that the schemes of our enemies are not dissimilar to our own, and that the freaks of chance are not determinable by calculation. In practice, we always base our preparations against an enemy on the assumption that his plans are good. Indeed, it is right to rest our hopes not on a belief in his blunders, but on the soundness of our provisions. Nor ought we to believe that there is much difference between man and man, but to think that the superiority lies with him who is reared in the severe school. These practices, then, which our ancestors have delivered to us, and by whose maintenance we have always profited, must not be given up. And we must not be hurried into deciding in a day's brief space a question which concerns many lives and fortunes in many cities, and in which honor is deeply involved, but we must decide calmly. This our strength peculiarly enables us to do. As for the Athenians, send to them on the matter of Potidæa, send on the matter of the alleged wrongs of the allies, particularly as they are prepared with legal satisfaction, and to proceed against one who offers arbitration as against a wrongdoer, law forbids. Meanwhile, do not omit preparation for war. This decision will be the best for yourselves, the most terrible for your opponents. Such were the words of Archidamus. Last came forward Sthenelaidas, one of the ephors for that year, and spoke to the Lacedaemonians as follows. The long speech of the Athenians I do not pretend to understand. They said a good deal in praise of themselves, but nowhere denied that they are injuring our allies in the Peloponnese. And yet if they behaved well against the Mede then, but ill towards us now, they deserve double punishment for having ceased to be good and for having become bad. We meanwhile are the same then and now, and shall not, if we are wise, disregard the wrongs of our allies, or put off till tomorrow the duty of assisting those who must suffer today. Others have much money and ships and horses, but we have good allies whom we must not give up to the Athenians, nor by lawsuits and words decide the matter, as it is anything but in word that we are harmed, but render instant and powerful help. And let us not be told that it is fitting for us to deliberate under injustice. Long deliberation is rather fitting for those who have injustice in contemplation. Vote therefore, Lacedaemonians, for war, as the honor of Sparta demands, and neither allow the further aggrandizement of Athens, nor betray our allies to ruin, but with the gods let us advance against the aggressors. With these words, he, as Ephor, himself put the question to the assembly of the Lacedaemonians. He said that he could not determine which was the loudest acclamation. Their mode of decision is by acclamation, not by voting. The fact being that he wished to make them declare their opinion openly, and thus to increase their ardor for war. Accordingly, he said, all Lacedaemonians who are of the opinion that the treaty has been broken, and that Athens is guilty, leave your seats and go there, pointing out a certain place. All who are the opposite opinion, there. They accordingly stood up and divided, and those who held that the treaty had been broken were in a decided majority. Summoning the allies, they told them that their opinion was that Athens had been guilty of injustice, but that they wished to convoke all the allies and put it to the vote in order that they might make war if they decided to do so on a common resolution. Having thus gained their point, the delegates returned home at once. The Athenian envoys a little later, when they had dispatched the objects of their mission. This decision of the assembly, judging that the treaty had been broken, was made in the 14th year of the 30 years' truce, which was entered into after the affair of Euboea. The Lacedaemonians voted that the treaty had been broken, and that war must be declared, not so much because they were persuaded by the arguments of the allies, but because they feared the growth of the power of the Athenians, seeing most of Greece already subject to them. Chapter 4. The growth of Athens' power began in this way. After the Medes, defeated by land and sea, had retreated from Europe, and those who had fled with their ships to Mycale were destroyed, Thucydides, the Spartan king and commander of the Hellenes at Mycale, returned home with his Peloponnesian allies. But the Athenians, along with their allies from Ionia and the Hellespont, who had now rebelled against the Persian king, remained. They laid siege to Cestus, which was still occupied by the Medes. After wintering there, they finally gained control of the city when the barbarians evacuated it. From Cestus, they sailed away from the Hellespont back to their own cities. Meanwhile, the Athenian people, with the barbarian threat gone from their land, immediately began to move their children, wives, and any remaining possessions back for where they had been stored. They then prepared to rebuild their city and its walls. Only isolated sections of the old walls still stood, and most houses were in ruins, though a few remained where Persian dignitaries had taken up residence. Seeing what the Athenians intended, the Spartans sent an embassy to Athens. They would have preferred that no city, Athens included, possess walls. But their allies strongly influenced them in this, being alarmed by Athens' newly acquired naval strength and the courage she had shown in the war against the Medes. The Spartans therefore urged Athens not only to refrain from building walls for herself, but also to help them tear down the remaining walls of other cities outside the Peloponnese. The real meaning behind their advice, the suspicion they harbored against Athens, was not openly stated. Instead, they argued that in the event of a third invasion, the barbarians would not have a strong base of operations, like Thebes had been, and that the Peloponnese would suffice for all as a base, both for retreat and attack. After the Spartans had made their case, the Athenians, following Themistocles' advice, immediately dismissed them. Their reply was that ambassadors would be sent to Sparta to discuss the matter. Themistocles instructed the Athenians to send him off to Sparta with all speed, but not to dispatch his colleagues as soon as they were chosen. Instead, they were to wait until the city walls had reached a height from which defense was possible. In the meantime, the entire population of Athens, men, women, and children, was to labor at the wall, sparing no building private or public, that could be used for the work. All such structures were to be torn down. After giving these instructions, and adding that he would take responsibility for all other matters in Sparta, Themistocles departed. Upon arriving in Sparta, he did not immediately seek an audience with the authorities. Instead, he tried to gain time and made excuses. When any government official asked him why he wasn't appearing in the assembly, he would say he was waiting for his colleagues, who had been delayed in Athens by some engagement. He added that he expected their speedy arrival and wondered why they weren't there yet. At first, the Spartans trusted Themistocles' words due to their existing friendship with him. But when other travelers arrived, all clearly stating that the wall was indeed being built and already reaching a significant height, they found it hard to disbelieve. Aware of their growing suspicion, Themistocles told them that rumors are deceptive and shouldn't be trusted. He suggested they send some reputable persons from Sparta to inspect the work, whose report could be relied upon. They dispatched the envoys accordingly. Themistocles secretly sent word to the Athenians to detain these Spartan envoys for as long as possible, without openly constraining them. They were not to be released until he and his colleagues had returned. For his colleagues, Abronichus and Aristides, had now joined him with the news that the wall was sufficiently advanced, and he feared that if the Spartans heard the facts, they might refuse to let them go. So the Athenians detained the envoys as instructed. Finally, Themistocles had an audience with the Spartans and openly told them that Athens was now sufficiently fortified to protect its inhabitants. He declared that any future embassy the Spartans or their allies might send to Athens should proceed on the assumption that the people they were visiting were capable of distinguishing both their own interests and the general interests of Hellas. He reminded them that when the Athenians chose to abandon their city and embark on their ships, they took that perilous step without consulting Sparta. Yet, whenever they had deliberated with the Spartans, they had proven themselves second to none in judgment. He then stated that they now believed it fitting for their city to have a wall, and that this would be more advantageous for both Athenian citizens and the Hellenic Confederacy. For without equal military strength, it was impossible to contribute equal or fair counsel to the common good. It followed, he observed, that either all members of the Confederacy should be unwalled, or that Athens' current action should be considered correct. The Spartans did not show any open signs of anger towards the Athenians at what they heard. The embassy, it seems, was prompted not by a desire to obstruct, but to guide their government's counsels. Besides, Spartan sentiment at that time was very friendly towards Athens because of the patriotism she had displayed in the struggle with the Medes. Still, the defeat of their wishes could not but cause them secret annoyance. The envoys from each state departed home without complaint. In this way, the Athenians walled their city in a short time. To this day, the building shows signs of the haste of its execution. The foundations are laid of stones of all kinds, in some places not shaped or fitted, but placed just as they were brought by the different workers. Many columns, too, from tombs, and sculptured stones were incorporated with the rest. For the city's boundaries were extended at every point, and so in their haste, they used everything without exception. Themistocles also persuaded them to complete the walls of Piraeus, which had been begun before, during his year as Archon. He was influenced by the excellent location, with its 3 natural harbors, and by the great advantage Athens would gain in power by becoming a naval people. For he was the first to dare tell them to commit to the sea and forthwith began to lay the foundations of their empire. It was also by his advice that they built the walls of Piraeus with a thickness still discernible today, the stones brought up by 2 wagons meeting each other. Between the inner and outer faces of these walls, there was neither rubble nor mortar, but great stones, hewn square and fitted together, clamped to each other on the outside with iron and lead. About half the intended height was finished. His idea was that their sheer size and thickness would repel enemy attacks. He thought they could be adequately defended by a small garrison of invalids, leaving the rest of the citizenry free for service in the fleet. For the fleet claimed most of his attention. He saw, I believe, that an attack by sea was easier for the Persian king's army than one by land. He also considered Piraeus more valuable than the upper city. Indeed, he was always advising the Athenians that if a day should come when they were hard-pressed by land, they should retreat to Piraeus and defy the world with their fleet. Thus, the Athenians completed their wall and began their other constructions immediately after the Medes' retreat. Meanwhile, Pausanias, son of Cleombrotus, was sent out from Sparta as commander-in-chief of the Hellenes, with 20 ships from the Peloponnese. With him sailed the Athenians, with 30 ships and a number of other allies. They launched an expedition against Cyprus and subdued most of the island, and afterwards against Byzantium, which was in Median hands, compelling it to surrender. This event took place while the Spartans were still supreme, but Pausanias' violent conduct had already begun to displease the Hellenes, particularly the Ionians and the newly liberated populations. These sought out the Athenians and requested them, as their kinsmen, to become their leaders and to put a stop to any violent actions by Pausanias. The Athenians accepted their offer and were determined to suppress such attempts and to manage all other affairs as their interests seemed to demand. In the meantime, the Spartans recalled Pausanias for an investigation into the reports they had received. Numerous and serious accusations have been brought against him by Hellenes arriving in Sparta, and by all appearances, he behaved more like a despot than a general. As it happened, his recall came just when the hatred he had inspired had caused the allies, except for the Peloponnesian soldiers, to desert him and side with the Athenians. Upon his arrival in Sparta, he was criticized for his private acts of oppression, but was acquitted on the most serious charges and pronounced not guilty. It should be noted that the charge of Medism, collaboration with the Persians, was one of the principal and seemingly best founded accusations against him. The Spartans, however, did not restore him to his command. Instead, they sent out Dorkes and others with a small force. These found the allies no longer willing to concede them supremacy. Realizing this, they departed, and the Spartans sent no one to replace them. They feared that others might experience a decline similar to Pausanias. Besides, they wished to be rid of the Persian War and were satisfied with the Athenians' competence for the leadership position and their friendship toward Sparta at the time. The Athenians, having thus succeeded to the supremacy by the voluntary act of the allies, due to their hatred of Pausanias, then determined which cities were to contribute money against the barbarian and which ships. Their stated objective was to retaliate for their sufferings by ravaging the king's country. Now was the time when the office of treasurers for Hellas was first established by the Athenians. These officers received the tribute, as the contributed money was called. The tribute was initially set at 460 talents. The common treasury was at Delos, and the congresses were held in the temple there. Athens' supremacy commenced with independent allies who acted on the resolutions of a common congress. This period was marked by the following military and administrative undertakings during the interval between the Persian and the Peloponnesian Wars: campaigns against the barbarians, against their own rebel allies, and against Peloponnesian powers with whom they came into contact. My reason for relating these events, and for venturing on this digression, is that this period of history has been omitted by all my predecessors, who confined themselves either to Greek history before the Persian War or to the Persian War itself. Hellanicus, it's true, did touch on these events in his Athenian history, but he is somewhat concise and not accurate in his dates. Besides, the history of these events provides an explanation for the growth of the Athenian Empire. First, under the command of Cimon, son of Miltiades, the Athenians besieged and captured Ion on the Strymon from the Medes, enslaving its inhabitants. Next, they enslaved Syros, the island in the Aegean inhabited by the Dolopians, and colonized it themselves. This was followed by a war against Charistus, in which the rest of Euboea remained neutral, and which ended in a surrender on agreed terms. After this, Naxos left the Confederacy. A war ensued, and she was forced to return after a siege. This was the first instance of an allied city breaking its agreement and being subjugated, a precedent which was followed by others as circumstances dictated. Of all the causes of defection that connected with arrears of tribute and ships, and with failure of service, was the chief. The Athenians were very severe and demanding, and made themselves offensive by applying the screw of necessity to men who were not used to, and in fact not disposed for, continuous labor. In some other respects, the Athenians were no longer the popular rulers they had been at first. And if they had more than their fair share of service, it was correspondingly easy for them to reduce any state that tried to leave the Confederacy. For this, the allies had themselves to blame. Their wish to avoid service led most of them to arrange to pay their share of the expense in money instead of ships, and so avoid having to leave their homes. Thus, while Athens increased her navy with the funds they contributed, a revolt always found them without resources or experience for war. Next, we come to the actions by land and by sea at the river Eurymedon, where the Athenians, with their allies, faced the Medes. The Athenians, under the command of Cimon, son of Miltiades, won both battles on the same day, capturing and destroying the entire Phoenician fleet of 200 vessels. Some time afterwards, the Thasians revolted. This was caused by disagreements over the trading posts on the opposite coast of Thrace and about the mine in their possession. Sailing with a fleet to Thassos, the Athenians defeated them at sea and landed on the island. About the same time, Athens sent 10,000 settlers composed of their own citizens and allies to establish a settlement at a place then called Enia Hodoi, or 9 Ways, now known as Amphipolis. They succeeded in taking Enia Hodoi from the Edonians, but when they advanced further into the interior of Thrace, they were cut off and killed at Drabescus, an Edonian town, by the assembled Thracians who viewed the Athenian settlement as an act of hostility. Meanwhile, the Thasians, defeated in battle and under siege, appealed to Sparta. They asked for assistance in the form of an invasion of Attica. Without informing Athens, Sparta promised and intended to do so, but was prevented by a major earthquake. This earthquake was accompanied by the secession of the Helots, along with the Thuriats and Ethians from the Perioeci, who fortified themselves at Ithome. Most of these Helots were descendants of the old Messenians, enslaved in a famous war, and so all of them came to be called Messenians. With the Spartans engaged in this war against the rebels at Ithome, the Thasians, in the 3rd year of their siege, secured terms from the Athenians. They were forced to pull down their walls, surrender their ships, and agree to pay the demanded funds at once, along with future tribute. They also gave up their possessions on the mainland, including the mine. The Spartans, meanwhile, finding the war against the rebels in Ithome likely to be prolonged, requested aid from their allies, especially the Athenians, who came in considerable force under Simon's command. The reason for these urgent summons lay in the Athenians' reputed skill in siege operations. A long siege had revealed to the Spartans their own deficiency in this art. Otherwise, they would have taken the place by assault. The first open quarrel between the Spartans and Athenians arose from this expedition. When their assault failed to take the fortress, the Spartans grew apprehensive. They feared the Athenians' enterprising and revolutionary character, and also viewed them as being of foreign extraction. They began to worry that if the Athenians remained, they might be persuaded by the besieged Ithome to attempt political changes. Accordingly, they dismissed only the Athenians from among their allies. They did not state their suspicions, but merely said they no longer needed them. But the Athenians, aware that their dismissal did not stem from an honorable reason, but from growing suspicions, departed deeply offended. They felt they had done nothing to merit such treatment from the Spartans. The instant they returned home, they broke off the alliance made against the Medes and allied themselves with Argos, Sparta's enemy. Both contracting parties took the same oaths and formed the same alliance with the Thessalians. Meanwhile, the rebels in Ithome, unable to prolong their 10 years of resistance, surrendered to Sparta. The conditions were that they should leave the Peloponnese under safe conduct and never set foot there again. Anyone found there thereafter would become the slave of their captor. It should be known that the Spartans had an old oracle from Delphi, advising them to release the suppliant of Zeus at Ithome. So, the rebels left with their children and wives. Due to the hatred Athens now felt for the Spartans, she received them and settled them at Naupactus, a town she had recently taken from the Ozolian Locrians. The Athenians received another addition to their confederacy in the Megarians, who left the Spartan alliance, annoyed by a border war forced upon them by Corinth. The Athenians occupied Megara and Pegae and built the Megarians their long walls from the city to Nicaea, in which they placed an Athenian garrison. This was the primary cause of the Corinthians conceiving such a deadly hatred against Athens. Meanwhile, Inaros, son of Psammetichus, a Libyan king based at Maria, near the Egyptian border above Pharos, instigated a revolt of almost all of Egypt from King Artaxerxes. Placing himself at its head, he invited the Athenians to his aid. Abandoning a Cyprian expedition they happened to be engaged in with 200 ships of their own and their allies, they arrived in Egypt. They sailed from a sea into the Nile, made themselves masters of the river and 2/3 of Memphis, and then turned their attention to attacking the remaining third, which was called the White Castle. Within it were Persians and Medes who had taken refuge there, and Egyptians who had not joined the rebellion. Meanwhile, the Athenians, making a descent from their fleet upon Halei, were engaged by a force of Corinthians and Epidaurians, and the Corinthians were victorious. Afterwards, the Athenians engaged the Peloponnesian fleet off Cecrophalia, and the Athenians were victorious. Subsequently, war broke out between Aegina and Athens, and there was a great naval battle off Aegina between the Athenians and Aeginetans, each aided by their allies. Victory went to the Athenians, who captured 70 of the enemy's ships, landed in the country, and commenced a siege under the command of Leocrates, son of Strabus. Upon this, the Peloponnesians, wishing to aid the Aeginetans, sent a force of 300 heavy infantry into Aegina. These soldiers had previously been serving with the Corinthians and Epidaurians. Meanwhile, the Corinthians and their allies occupied the heights of Geronea and marched down into the Megarid. They believed that, with a large force absent in Aegina and Egypt, Athens would be unable to help the Megarians without raising the siege of Aegina. But the Athenians, instead of moving the army from Aegina, raised a force of the old and young men who had been left in the city, and marched into the Megarid under the command of Myronides. After an indecisive battle with the Corinthians, the rival armies parted, each believing they had won. The Athenians, however, if anything, had a slight advantage, and upon the Corinthians' departure, they set up a trophy. Urged by the taunts of the elders in their city, the Corinthians made their preparations, and about 12 days later, They returned and set up their own trophy as victors. Sallying out from Megara, the Athenians cut off the party erecting the trophy, engaged, and defeated the rest. In the retreat of the vanquished army, a considerable division, pressed by the pursuers and mistaking the road, dashed into a private field with a deep trench all around it and no way out. Knowing the place, the Athenians hemmed their front with heavy infantry and, placing light troops in a circle around them, stoned all who had entered. Corinth suffered a severe blow here. The bulk of her army continued its retreat home. About this time, the Athenians began to build the long walls to the sea, one towards Phalerum and one towards Piraeus. Meanwhile, the Phocians launched an expedition against Doris, the ancient homeland of the Spartans, which contained the towns of Berm, Catinium, and Erineum. They had captured one of these towns when the Spartans, under Nicomedes, son of Cleombrotus, who commanded for King Pleistoanax, then still a minor, came to the aid of the Dorians. They brought 1,500 of their own heavy infantry and 10,000 of their allies. After compelling the Phocians to restore the town on agreed conditions, they began their retreat. The route by sea, across the Crissaean Gulf, put them at risk of being intercepted by the Athenian fleet. The route across Gerenia seemed scarcely safe, as the Athenians held Megara and Pegae. For the pass was a difficult one, always guarded by the Athenians, and in this instance, the Spartans had information that the Athenians intended to dispute their passage. So, they resolved to remain in Boeotia and consider which would be the safest line of march. They also had another reason for this decision. Secret encouragement had been given to them by a party in Athens, who hoped to put an end to the reign of democracy and the construction of the long walls. Meanwhile, the Athenians marched against them with their entire levy, 1,000 Argives, and contingents from the rest of their allies. Altogether, they numbered 14,000 strong. The march was prompted by the notion that the Spartans were at a loss how to effect their passage, and also by suspicions of an attempt to overthrow democracy. Some cavalry also joined the Athenians from their Thessalian allies, but these went over to the Spartans during the battle. The battle was fought at Tanagra in Boeotia. After heavy losses on both sides, victory was declared for the Spartans and their allies. After entering the Megarid and cutting down the fruit trees, the Spartans returned home across Gerenia and the Isthmus. 62 days after the battle, the Athenians marched into Boeotia under the command of Myronides. They defeated the Boeotians in battle at Enophita and became masters of Boeotia and Phocis. They dismantled the walls of the Tanagrians, took 100 of the wealthiest men of the Opuntian Locrians as hostages, and finished their own long walls. This was followed by the surrender of the Aeginetans to Athens on conditions. They pulled down their walls, gave up their ships, and agreed to pay tribute in the future. The Athenians then sailed around the Peloponnese under Ptolemides, son of Ptolemaeus. They burned the arsenal of Sparta, took Chalcis, a Corinthian town, and in a descent upon Sicyon, they defeated the Sicyonians in battle. Meanwhile, the Athenians and their allies in Egypt were still there, encountering all the vicissitudes of war. At first, the Athenians controlled Egypt, and the king sent Megabazus, a Persian, to Sparta with money to bribe the Peloponnesians to invade Attica and thus draw off the Athenians from Egypt. Finding that the matter made no progress and that the money was only being wasted, he recalled Megabazus with the remainder of the money. He then sent Megabazus, son of Zopyrus, another Persian, with a large army to Egypt. Arriving by land, Megabazus defeated the Egyptians and their allies in a battle, drove the Hellenes out of Memphis, and eventually trapped them in the island of Prosopitis, where he besieged them for a year and 6 months. At last, draining the canal by diverting its waters into another channel. He left their ships stranded. He then connected most of the island to the mainland, marched over on foot, and captured it. Thus, the Greek enterprise came to ruin after 6 years of war. Of that large host, a few traveled through Libya and reached Cyrene safely, but most of them perished. And so, Egypt returned to its subjection to the king, except for Amartius, the king in the marshes, whom they were unable to capture due to the vastness of the marsh, and because the marshmen were the most warlike of the Egyptians. Inaros, the Libyan king and the sole instigator of the Egyptian revolt, was betrayed, captured, and crucified. Meanwhile, a relieving squadron of 50 vessels had sailed from Athens and the rest of the Confederacy for Egypt. They landed at the Mendesian mouth of the Nile, completely unaware of what had occurred. Attacked on the land side by troops, and from the sea by the Phoenician navy, most of their ships were destroyed. The few remaining were saved by retreat. Such was the end of the great expedition of the Athenians and their allies to Egypt. Meanwhile, Orestes, son of Echecratidas, the Thessalian king, being in exile from Thessaly, persuaded the Athenians to restore him. Taking with them the Boeotians and Phocians, their allies, the Athenians marched to Pharsalus in Thessaly. They gained control of the country, though only in the immediate vicinity of their camp, beyond which they could not go for fear of the Thessalian cavalry. But they failed to take the city or to achieve any of the other objectives of their expedition, and returned home with Orestes without having accomplished anything. Not long after this, 1,000 Athenians embarked in the vessels that were at Pegi. Pegi, it must be remembered, was now theirs, and sailed along the coast to Sicyon under the command of Pericles, son of Xanthippus. Landing in Sicyon and defeating the Sicyonians who engaged them, they immediately took with them the Achaeans and, sailing across, marched against and laid siege to Enneade in Acarnania. Failing, however, to take it, they returned home. 3 years afterwards, a truce was made between the Peloponnesians and Athenians for 5 years. Released from the Hellenic War, the Athenians made an expedition to Cyprus with 200 vessels of their own and their allies, under the command of Cimon. 60 of these were detached to Egypt at the instance of Amartius, the king in the marshes. The rest laid siege to Kidium, from which, however, they were compelled to retire by the death of Cimon and by scarcity of provisions. Sailing off Salamis in Cyprus, they fought with the Phoenicians, Cyprians, and Cilicians by land and sea, and, being victorious on both elements, departed home, bringing with them the squadron that had returned from Egypt. After this, the Spartans marched out on a sacred war, and, becoming masters of the temple at Delphi, they placed it in the hands of the Delphians. Immediately after their retreat, the Athenians marched out, became masters of the temple, and placed it in the hands of the Phocians. Some time after this, Orchomenus, Corunia, and some other places in Boeotia being in the hands of Boeotian exiles, the Athenians marched against these hostile places with 1,000 Athenian heavy infantry and allied contingents, under the command of Ptolemaides, son of Ptolemaeus. They took Corunia, enslaved its inhabitants, and, leaving a garrison, began their return journey. On their road, they were attacked at Corunia by the Boeotian exiles from Orchomenus, with some Locrians, Euboean exiles, and others who shared their views. They were defeated in battle, with some killed and others taken captive. The Athenians then evacuated all of Boeotia by a treaty that provided for the recovery of their men, and the exiled Boeotians returned, regaining their independence along with all the rest. This was soon afterwards followed by the revolt of Euboea from Athens. Pericles had already crossed over to the island with an Athenian army when news reached him that Megara had revolted, that the Peloponnesians were on the point of invading Attica, and that the Athenian garrison had been cut off by the Megarians, with the exception of a few who had taken refuge in Nicaea. The Megarians had introduced the Corinthians, Sicyonians, and Epidaurians into the town before they revolted. Meanwhile, Pericles brought his army back in all haste from Euboea. After this, the Peloponnesians marched into Attica as far as Eleusis and Thrius, ravaging the countryside under the command of King Pleistoanax, son of Pausanias, and without advancing further, returned home. The Athenians then crossed over again to Euboea under the command of Pericles and subdued the entire island. All but Histiaea was settled by agreement. The Histiaeans were expelled from their homes and occupied their territory themselves. Not long after their return from Euboea, they made a truce with the Spartans and their allies for 30 years, giving up the posts they occupied in the Peloponnese, Nicaea, Pegae, Treason, and Achaia. In the 6th year of the truce, war broke out between the Samians and Milesians over Priene. Worsted in the war, the Milesians came to Athens with loud complaints against the Samians. They were joined by certain private citizens from Samos itself who wished to revolutionize the government. Accordingly, the Athenians sailed to Samos with 40 ships and established a democracy. They took 50 boys and 50 men as hostages from the Samians, housed them in Lemnos, and after leaving a garrison on the island, returned home. But some of the Samians had not remained on the island. They had fled to the mainland, making an agreement with the most powerful figures in the city, and an alliance with Pisitheus, son of Hystaspes, the then satrap of Sardis. They gathered a force of 700 mercenaries and, under cover of night, crossed over to Samos. Their first step was to attack the commons, most of whom they secured. Their next goal was to steal their hostages from Lemnos. After this, they revolted, handed over the Athenian garrison left with them and its commanders to Pisitheus, and immediately prepared for an expedition against Miletus. The Byzantines also revolted with them. As soon as the Athenians heard the news, they sailed with 60 ships against Samos. 16 of these went to Caria to look out for the Phoenician fleet, and to Chios and Lesbos, carrying orders for reinforcements, and so never engaged. But 44 ships under the command of Pericles, with 9 colleagues, gave battle off the island of Tragia to 70 Samian vessels, of which 20 were transports, as they were sailing from Miletus. Victory remained with the Athenians. Reinforced afterwards by 40 ships from Athens and 25 Chian and Lesbian vessels, the Athenians landed. Having superiority by land, they invested the city with 3 walls. It was also blockaded from the sea. Meanwhile, Pericles took 60 ships from the blockading squadron and departed in haste for Caunus and Curia, as intelligence had been received of the approach of the Phoenician fleet to aid the Samians. Indeed, Stysagoras and others had already left the island with 5 ships to bring them. But in the meantime, the Samians made a sudden sally and fell upon the camp, which they found unfortified, destroying the lookout vessels and engaging and defeating those being launched to meet them. They remained masters of their own seas for 14 days and carried on and carried out what they pleased. But upon Pericles' arrival, they were once more shut up. Fresh reinforcements afterwards arrived. 40 ships from Athens with Thucydides, Hagnon, and Phormio, 20 with Lipolemus and Anticles, and 30 vessels from Chios and Lesbos. After a brief attempt at fighting, the Samians, unable to hold out, were subdued after a 9-month siege and surrendered on conditions. They raised their walls, gave hostages, delivered up their ships, and agreed to pay the expenses of the war by installments. The Byzantines also agreed to be subjects as before. Chapter 5. After this, though not many years later, we finally arrive at the events already mentioned, the affairs of Corcyra and Potidaea, and the incidents that served as a pretext for the present war. All these conflicts between Hellenic states and against the barbarians occurred during the 50-year interval between Xerxes' retreat and the beginning of the current war. During this period, the Athenians succeeded in placing their empire on a firmer basis and greatly increased their power at home. The Spartans, though fully aware of Athens' growing strength, opposed it only for a short while, remaining largely inactive for most of the period. This was partly due to their ancient reluctance to go to war except under dire necessity, and partly because they were hampered by internal conflicts. Eventually, the growth of Athenian power could no longer be ignored, and their own confederacy became the object of its encroachments. They then felt they could endure it no longer, but that the time had come for them to dedicate themselves wholeheartedly to breaking this hostile power, if they could, by commencing the present war. Although the Spartans had already decided that the treaty had been broken and that the Athenians were guilty, they still sent to Delphi and inquired of the god whether it would be good for them to go to war. As it is reported, they received the answer that if they put their full strength into the war, victory would be theirs, and a promise that the god himself would be with them, whether invoked or uninvoked. Still, they wished to summon their allies again and take their vote on the propriety of making war. After the ambassadors from the Confederates arrived and a Congress was convened, they all spoke their minds, most of them denouncing the Athenians and demanding that the war begin. The Corinthians, in particular, were vocal. They had previously canvassed the individual cities to persuade them to vote for war, fearing it might come too late to save Potidaea. They were present on this occasion as well, coming forward last, and made the following speech. Fellow allies, we can no longer accuse the Spartans of having failed in their duty. They have not only voted for war themselves, but have assembled us here for that purpose. We say their duty, for supremacy has its duties. Besides fairly administering private interests, leaders are required to show special care for the common welfare, in return for the special honors accorded to them in other ways. For our part, all who have already had dealings with the Athenians need no warning to be on their guard against them. But the states more inland and out of the main routes of communication should understand that if they fail to support the coastal powers, it will hinder the export of their produce and the receipt of their imports from the sea. They must not carelessly judge what is now being said, as if it had nothing to do with them. Instead, they must expect that the sacrifice of the coastal powers will one day be followed by the extension of the danger to the interior, and they must recognize that their own interests are deeply involved in this discussion. For these reasons, they should not hesitate to exchange peace for war. If wise men remain quiet while they are not injured, brave men abandon peace for war when they are injured, returning to an understanding of a favorable opportunity. In fact, they are neither intoxicated by their success in war, nor disposed to endure an injury for the sake of the delightful tranquility of peace. Indeed, to falter for the sake of such delights is, if you remain inactive, the quickest way of losing the very repose you cling to. While to conceive extravagant pretensions from success in war is to forget how hollow is the confidence by which you are elated. For if many ill-conceived plans have succeeded through the still greater foolishness of an opponent, many more, apparently well laid, have on the contrary ended in disgrace. The confidence with which we form our schemes is never completely justified in their execution. Planning is carried on in safety, but when it comes to action, fear often causes failure. To apply these rules to ourselves, if we are now kindling war, it is under the pressure of injury, with adequate grounds for complaint. And after we have chastised the Athenians, we will in due season desist. We have many reasons to expect success. First, superiority in numbers and in military experience. And secondly, our general and unvarying obedience in the execution of orders. The naval strength they possess shall be raised by us from our respective existing resources and from the moneys at Olympia and Delphi. A loan from these enables us to entice their foreign sailors by offering higher pay. For the power of Athens is more mercenary than national, while ours will not be exposed to the same risk, as its strength lies more in men than in money. A single defeat at sea is in all likelihood their ruin. Should they manage to hold out, in that case there will be more time for us to train ourselves in naval matters. As soon as we achieve equality in skill, we scarcely need to ask whether we shall be their superiors in courage. For the advantages that we have by nature, they cannot acquire by education, while their superiority in skill must be overcome by our practice. The money required for these objectives shall be provided by our contributions. Nothing, indeed, could be more monstrous than the suggestion that, while their allies never tire of contributing for their own servitude, we should refuse to spend for vengeance and self-preservation the treasure which, by such refusal, we shall forfeit to Athenian rapacity and see employed for our own ruin. We also have other ways of conducting the war, such as inciting revolt among their allies, the surest method of depriving them of their revenues, which are the source of their strength, and establishing fortified positions in their country, and various operations which cannot be foreseen at present. For war, of all things, proceeds least upon definite rules, but draws principally upon itself for contrivances to meet an emergency. In such cases, the party who faces the struggle and keeps his temper best meets with the most security, and he who loses his temper about it with corresponding disaster. Let us also reflect that if it were merely a number of territorial disputes between rival neighbors, it might be endured. But here we have an enemy in Athens that is a match for our whole coalition, and more than a match for any of its individual members. So that unless, as a body and as individual nationalities and individual cities, we make a unanimous stand against her, she will easily conquer us, divided and in detail. That conquest, terrible as it may sound, would, it must be known, have no other end than slavery, pure and simple, a word which the Peloponnese cannot even hear whispered without disgrace, or without disgrace see so many states abused by one. Meanwhile, the opinion would be either that we were justly so treated, or that we endured it from cowardice, proving ourselves degenerate sons in not even securing for ourselves the freedom which our fathers gave to Hellas, and in allowing the establishment in Hellas of a tyrant state, though in individual states we think it our duty to put down sole rulers. And we do not know how this conduct can be held free from three of the gravest failings: lack of sense, of courage, or of vigilance. For we do not suppose that you have taken refuge in that contempt of an enemy which has proved so fatal in so many instances, a feeling which, from the numbers it has ruined, has come to be called not contemptuous, but contemptible. There is, however, no advantage in reflections on the past further than may be of service to the present. For the future, we must provide by maintaining what the present gives us and redoubling our efforts. It is hereditary to us to win virtue as the fruit of labor, and you must not change this habit, even though you should have a slight advantage in wealth and resources. For it is not right that what was won in want should be lost in plenty. No, we must boldly advance to the war for many reasons. The god has commanded it and promised to be with us, and the rest of Hellas will all join in the struggle, partly from fear, partly from interest. You will be the first to break a treaty which the god, in advising us to go to war, judges to be violated already, but rather to support a treaty that has been outraged. Indeed, treaties are broken not by resistance, but by aggression. Your position, therefore, from whatever quarter you may view it, will amply justify you in going to war. In this step we recommend, in the interest of all, bearing in mind that identity of interest is the surest of bonds, whether between states or individuals. Delay not, therefore, to assist Potidaea, a Dorian city besieged by Ionians, which is quite a reversal of the natural order of things, nor to assert the freedom of the rest. It is impossible for us to wait any longer when waiting can only mean immediate disaster for some of us. And if it becomes known that we have conferred but do not venture to protect ourselves, like disaster in the near future for the rest. Delay not, fellow allies, but, convinced of the necessity of the crisis and the wisdom of this council, vote for the war, undeterred by its immediate terrors, but looking beyond to the lasting peace by which it will be succeeded. Out of war, peace gains fresh stability. But to refuse to abandon repose for war is not a sure method of avoiding danger. We must believe that the tyrant city that has been established in Hellas has been established against all alike, with a program of universal empire, part fulfilled, part in contemplation. Let us then attack and reduce it, and win future security for ourselves and freedom for the Hellenes who are now enslaved. Such were the words of the Corinthians. The Spartans, having now heard all, gave their opinion, then took the vote of all the allied states present, great and small alike. The majority voted for war. This decided, it was still impossible for them to commence at once, due to their lack of preparation. But it was resolved that the necessary means were to be procured by the different states, and that there was to be no delay. And indeed, in spite of the time occupied with the necessary arrangements, less than a year elapsed before Attica was invaded, and the war openly began. This interval was spent in sending embassies to Athens charged with complaints, in order to obtain as good a pretext for war as possible, should she pay no attention to them. The first Spartan embassy was to order the Athenians to drive out the curse of the goddess, the history of which is as follows. In former generations, there was an Athenian named Cylon, an Olympic victor of good birth and powerful position, who had married a daughter of Thucydides, the then tyrant of Megara. This Cylon, inquiring at Delphi, was told by the god to seize the Acropolis of Athens on a grand festival of Zeus. Accordingly, securing a force from Thucydides and persuading his friends to join him, when the Olympic festival in the Peloponnese came, he seized the Acropolis with the intention of making himself tyrant. He thought this was the grand festival of Zeus, and also an occasion appropriate for an Olympic victor. Whether the grand festival meant was in Attica or elsewhere was a question he never considered, and which the oracle did not offer to solve. The Athenians also have a festival called the Grand Festival of Zeus Mylikios, or Gracious, known as the Diasia. It is celebrated outside the city, and the whole people sacrifice not real victims, but a number of bloodless offerings peculiar to the country. However, Cylon, fancying he had chosen the right time, made the attempt. As soon as the Athenians perceived it, they flocked in, one and all, from the countryside and laid siege to the citadel. But as time went on, weary of the labor blockade, most of them departed. The responsibility of keeping guard was left to the 9 archons, with full powers to arrange everything according to their good judgment. It must be known that at that time, most political functions were discharged by these 9 archons. Meanwhile, Cylon and his besieged companions suffered from lack of food and water. Accordingly, Cylon and his brother escaped, but the rest, being hard-pressed, and some even dying of famine, seated themselves as supplicants at the altar in the Acropolis. The Athenians who were charged with keeping guard, seeing them at the point of death in the temple, raised them up on the understanding that no harm should be done to them. They led them out and then slew them. Some who, as they passed, took refuge at the altars of the awful goddesses were dispatched on the spot. From this deed, The men who killed them were called accursed and guilty against the goddess, they and their descendants. Accordingly, these cursed ones were driven out by the Athenians and driven out again by Cleomenes of Sparta and an Athenian faction. The living were exiled, and the bones of the dead were exhumed and cast out. For all that, they came back afterwards, and their descendants are still in the city. This, then, was the curse that the Spartans ordered them to drive out. They were actuated primarily, as they pretended, by a concern for the honor of the gods. But they also knew that Pericles, son of Xanthippus, was connected with the curse on his mother's side, and they thought that his banishment would materially advance their designs on Athens. Not that they truly hoped to succeed in procuring this. Rather, they thought to create prejudice against him in the eyes of his countrymen, from the feeling that the war would be partly caused by his misfortune. For being the most powerful man of his time and the leading Athenian statesman, he opposed the Spartans in everything and would allow no concessions. But he never urged the Athenians onto war. The Athenians retorted by ordering the Spartans to drive out the curse of Taenaris. The Spartans had once raised some Helot supplicants from the temple of Poseidon at Taenaris, led them away, and slain them. For this, they believed the great earthquake at Sparta to have been a retribution. The Athenians also ordered them to drive out the curse of the goddess of the brazen house, the history of which is as follows. After Pausanias the Spartan had been recalled by the Spartans from his command in the Hellespont, this being his first recall, and had been tried by them and acquitted, not being again sent out in a public capacity, he took a galley from Hermione on his own responsibility, without the authority of the Spartans, and arrived as a private person in the Hellespont. He came ostensibly for the Hellenic War, but really to carry on his intrigues with the king, which he had begun before his recall, being ambitious of reigning over Hellas. The circumstance which first enabled him to place the king under an obligation, and to begin his whole design, was this. Some connections and kinsmen of the king had been taken in Byzantium, upon its capture from the Medes, when Pausanias was first there after the return from Cyprus. These captives he sent off to the king without the knowledge of the rest of the allies, the official account being that they had escaped from him. He managed this with the help of Gondulus, an Eretrian, whom he had placed in charge of Byzantium and the prisoners. He also gave Gondulus a letter for the king, the contents of which were as follows, as was afterwards discovered. Pausanias, the general of Sparta, anxious to do you a favor, sends you these prisoners of war. I propose also, with your approval, to marry your daughter, and to make Sparta and the rest of Hellas subject to you. I may say that I think I am able to do this with your cooperation. Accordingly, if any of this pleases you, send a trustworthy man to the sea through whom we may in the future conduct our correspondence. This was all that the letter revealed, and Xerxes was pleased with its contents. He immediately dispatched Artabazus, son of Pharnaces, to the coast with orders to replace Megabates, the current governor of the Dascylian satrapy. Artabazus was also instructed to deliver a letter, entrusted to him by the king, to Pausanias in Byzantium as quickly as possible. He was to show Pausanias the royal signet and execute any commission he received from him regarding the king's affairs with utmost care and loyalty. Upon his arrival, Artabazus carried out the king's orders and sent the letter, which contained the following reply. Thus says King Xerxes to Pausanias, for the men you have saved for me across the sea from Byzantium, an obligation is recorded in our house, preserved forever. I am well pleased with your proposals. Let neither night nor day prevent you from diligently fulfilling any of your promises to me. Let them not be hindered by the cost of gold or silver, nor by the number of troops, wherever their presence may be needed. But with Artabazus, an honorable man whom I send to you, boldly advance my objectives and yours, as may best serve the honor and interest of us both. Previously held in high esteem by the Greeks as the hero of Plataea, Pausanias, upon receiving this letter, grew prouder than ever. He could no longer live in his customary manner. He departed from Byzantium dressed in Median attire, attended on his journey through Thrace by a bodyguard of Medes and Egyptians, and maintained a Persian table. He was utterly unable to conceal his intentions, betraying through small acts the grand ambitions he hoped one day to fulfill. He also made himself inaccessible and displayed such a violent temper towards everyone that no one could approach him. Indeed, this was the primary reason the Confederacy eventually sided with the Athenians. Reports of Pausanias's conduct reached the Lacedaemonians, leading to his first recall. And after his second voyage abroad, undertaken in the ship of Hermione without their authorization, he exhibited similar behavior. Besieged and expelled from Byzantium by the Athenians, he did not return to Sparta. Instead, news arrived that he had settled at Colone in the Troad, where he was conspiring with foreign powers, and that his presence there served no good purpose. The ephors, no longer hesitant, sent him a herald with a skidily, a secret message, ordering him to accompany the herald or be declared a public enemy. Anxious above all to avoid suspicion, and confident he could quash the charges with money, he returned a second time to Sparta. Initially imprisoned by the ephors, whose authority allowed them to do this even to the king, he soon settled the matter and was released, offering himself for trial to anyone who wished to initiate an inquiry against him. Now, the Spartans lacked tangible proof against him, from either his enemies or the nation itself, of the irrefutable kind required for the punishment of a member of the royal family, especially one holding such high office. He was, after all, regent for his first cousin King Pleistarchus, son of Leonidas, who was still a minor. However, his contempt for the laws and imitation of foreign customs gave rise to much suspicion that he was discontent with the established order. All instances where he had deviated from traditional customs were reviewed, and it was recalled that he had presumptuously inscribed on the tripod at Delphi, dedicated by the Greeks from the spoils of the Medes, the following couplet: "The Mede defeated, great Pausanias raised. This monument that Phoebus might be praised for." At the time, the Lacedaemonians had immediately erased the couplet and instead inscribed the names of the cities that had helped overthrow the foreign invader and dedicate the offering. Yet, it was considered that Pausanias had been guilty of a grave offense, which, when interpreted in light of his subsequent behavior, gained new significance and seemed quite consistent with his current schemes. Furthermore, they were informed that he was even conspiring with the Helots. This was indeed true, for he had promised them freedom and citizenship if they would join him in insurrection and help him carry out his plans to completion. Even now, mistrusting the evidence even from the Helots themselves, the ephors would not consent to take any decisive step against him, adhering to their usual custom of being slow to take an irrevocable decision against a Spartan citizen without indisputable proof. At last, it is said, the person who was to carry the final letter to Artabazus for the king, a man from Argolis, once Pausanias's favorite and most trusted servant, turned informer. Alarmed by the thought that none of the previous messengers had ever returned, he counterfeited Pausanias's seal. This was so that if his suspicions proved wrong, or if Pausanias asked to make a correction, he would not be discovered. He then opened the letter and found the postscript he had suspected, an order to put him to death. Upon being shown the letter, the ephors felt more certain. Still, they wished to hear Pausanias incriminate himself with their own ears. Accordingly, the man went by appointment to Taenarus as a suppliant and built a hut there, divided into two by a partition. Inside, he concealed some of the ephors and allowed them to hear the entire matter clearly. Pausanias came to him and asked the reason for his suppliant position. The man then reproached him with the order he had written concerning him, and one by one revealed all the other circumstances. How he, who had never put Pausanias in danger while acting as an agent between him and the king, was now to be rewarded with death, just like common servants. Admitting all this, and telling him not to be angry about it, Pausanias gave him a pledge to raise him from the temple and begged him to depart as quickly as possible, so as not to hinder the ongoing business. The ephors listened carefully and then departed, taking no action for the moment. But, having at last achieved certainty, they prepared to arrest him in the city. It is reported that as he was about to be arrested in the street, he saw from the face of one of the ephors what was coming. Another, too, made him a secret signal, betraying it to him out of kindness. Setting off at a run for the temple of the goddess of the brazen house, whose enclosure was nearby, he succeeded in taking sanctuary before they could seize him. He entered a small chamber, which was part of the temple, to avoid being exposed to the weather, and lay still there. The ephors, momentarily outpaced in the pursuit, afterwards removed the roof of the chamber. Having confirmed he was inside, they sealed him in, barricaded the doors, and waited before the place, intending to starve him. When they found he was on the point of expiring, just as he was in the chamber, they brought him out of the temple while he still breathed. As soon as he was brought out, he died. They were going to throw him into the Kaidas, where they cast criminals, but finally decided to bury him somewhere nearby. But the god at Delphi later ordered the Lacedaemonians to move the tomb to the place of his death, where he now lies in consecrated ground, as an inscription on a monument declares. And, as what had been done was a curse upon them, they were to give back 2 bodies instead of 1 to the goddess of the brazen house. So they had 2 brazen statues made and dedicated them as a substitute for Pausanias. The Athenians retorted by telling the Lacedaemonians to expel what the god himself had pronounced to be a curse. To return to Pausanias's collaboration with the Persians, evidence found during the inquiry implicated Themistocles. The Lacedaemonians accordingly sent envoys to the Athenians, demanding they punish him as they had punished Pausanias. The Athenians consented. However, as it happened, Themistocles had been ostracized and, residing in Argos, was accustomed to visiting other parts of the Peloponnese. So, they sent individuals with the Lacedaemonians who were ready to join the pursuit, with instructions to seize him wherever they found him. But Themistocles caught wind of their intentions and fled from the Peloponnese to Corcyra, a state indebted to him. Yet, the Corcyrians claimed they could not risk sheltering him at the cost of offending Athens and Lacedaemon, and they conveyed him to the opposite mainland. Pursued by officers who were following reports of his movements, and at a loss where to turn, he was compelled to stop at the house of Admetus, the Melatian king, even though they were not on friendly terms. Admetus happened not to be home, but his wife, to whom Themistocles appealed as a suppliant, instructed him to take their child in his arms and sit by the hearth. Soon afterwards, Admetus entered, and Themistocles told him who he was. He begged the king not to seek revenge on an exiled Themistocles for any opposition his requests might have encountered from Themistocles in Athens. Indeed, he was now far too low for such revenge. Retaliation was honorable only between equals. Besides, his opposition to the king had only affected the success of a request, not the safety of his person. If the king were to surrender him to the pursuers he mentioned, and to the fate they intended for him, he would simply be condemning him to certain death. The king listened to him and, raising him up with his son, as Themistocles sat with the child in his arms in the most effective posture of supplication, refused to give him up to the Lacedaemonians who arrived not long afterwards, despite anything they could say. Instead, he sent him by land to the other sea, to Pydna and Alexander's dominions, as Themistocles wished to go to the Persian king. There, he encountered a merchant ship about to sail for Ionia. Going on board, he was caught in a storm and carried towards the Athenian squadron blockading Naxos. In his alarm, luckily, he was unknown to the people on the vessel. He told the master who he was and why he was fleeing, stating that if the master refused to save him, he would declare that he was taking him for a bribe. Meanwhile, their safety depended on allowing no one to leave the ship until a favorable time for sailing arose. If the master complied with his wishes, Themistocles promised him proper compensation. The master acted as desired, and after lying for a day and a night out of reach of the squadron, they at length arrived at Ephesus. After rewarding him with a sum of money, as soon as he received some from his friends in Athens and from his secret hordes in Argos, Themistocles began his journey inland with one of the coastal Persians. He sent a letter to King Artaxerxes, son of Xerxes, who had just ascended to the throne. Its contents were as follows: I, Themistocles, am come to you, I who did your house more harm than any other Greek when I was compelled to defend myself against your father's invasion. However, this harm was far surpassed by the good I did him during his retreat, which brought no danger for me, but much for him. For the past, you are indebted to me for a good turn. Here he mentioned the warning sent to Xerxes from Salamis to retreat, as well as his finding the bridges unbroken, which, as he falsely claimed, was due to him, for the present, able to render you great service. I am here, pursued by the Greeks for my friendship towards you. However, I desire a year's grace, when I shall be able to declare in person the objects of my coming. It is said that the king approved his intention and told him to do as he said. Themistocles used the interval to make what progress he could in studying the Persian language and the customs of the country. Arriving at court at the end of the year, he attained very high consideration there, such as no Greek had ever possessed before or since. This was partly due to his splendid past achievements, partly from the hopes he held out of effecting the subjugation of Greece for the king, but principally from the daily proof of his capacity. For Themistocles was a man who exhibited the most undeniable signs of genius. Indeed, in this particular, he has an extraordinary and unparalleled claim on our admiration. By his own native ability, both unformed and unsupplemented by study, he was at once the best judge in sudden crises that allowed little or no deliberation, and the best prophet of the future, even to its most distant possibilities. An able theoretical expositor of all that fell within the sphere of his practice, he was not without the power of passing an adequate judgment in matters in which he had no experience. He could also excellently discern the good and evil hidden in the unseen future. In short, whether we consider the extent of his natural powers or the slightness of his formal education, this extraordinary man must be acknowledged to have surpassed all others in the faculty of intuitively meeting an emergency. Disease was the real cause of his death, though there is a story of his having ended his life by poison upon finding himself unable to fulfill his promises to the king. However this may be, there is a monument to him in the marketplace of Asiatic Magnesia. He was governor of the district, the king having given him Magnesia, which brought in 50 talents a year for his bread. Lampsacus, considered the richest wine country for his wine, and Meos for other provisions. His bones, it is said, were conveyed home by his relatives in accordance with his wishes and interred in Attic ground. This was done without the knowledge of the Athenians, as it was against the law to bury an outlaw for treason in Attica. So ends the history of Pausanias and Themistocles, the Lacedaemonian and the Athenian, the most famous men of their time in Greece. To return to the Lacedaemonians, the history of their first embassy, the commands it conveyed, and the response it provoked concerning the expulsion of those under a religious curse has already been told. This was followed by a second embassy, which ordered Athens to lift the siege of Potidæa and to respect the independence of Aegina. Above all, it made it distinctly clear that war could be prevented by revoking the Megarian decree, which excluded the Megarians from using Athenian harbors and markets. But Athens was unwilling either to revoke the decree or to accept their other proposals. She accused the Megarians of encroaching on consecrated ground and disputed borderlands, and of sheltering her runaway slaves. At last, an embassy arrived with the Lacedaemonian ultimatum. The ambassadors were Ramphias, Melesippus, and Aegisander. Not a word was said about any of the old subjects. Their message was simply this: Lacedaemon wishes the peace to continue, and there is no reason why it should not, if you would leave the Hellenes independent. Upon this, the Athenians held an assembly and put the matter before them for consideration. It was resolved to deliberate once and for all on all their demands, and to give them a single answer. Many speakers came forward, supporting one side or the other, urging the necessity of war or the revocation of the decree and the folly of allowing it to stand in the way of peace. Among them came forward Pericles, son of Xanthippus, the foremost man of his time in Athens, equally skilled in counsel and in action, and he gave the following advice: There is one principle, Athenians, which I hold to above all else, and that is the principle of no concession to the Peloponnesians. I know that the spirit which inspires men, while they are being persuaded to make war, is not always retained in action. That as circumstances change, resolutions change. Yet I see that now, as before, the same, almost literally the same, counsel is demanded of me. And I put it to those of you who are allowing yourselves to be persuaded, to support the national resolve even in the case of reverses, or to forfeit all credit for your wisdom in the event of success. For sometimes the course of things is as arbitrary as the plans of man. Indeed, this is why we usually blame chance for whatever does not happen as we expected. Now it was clear before that Lacedaemon harbored designs against us. It is still clearer now. The treaty provides that we shall mutually submit our differences to legal settlement, and that we shall meanwhile each keep what we have. Yet the Lacedaemonians have never made us such an offer. They would never accept such an offer from us. On the contrary, they wish complaints to be settled by war instead of by negotiation. And in the end, we find them here dropping the tone of expostulation and adopting that of command. They order us to raise the siege of Potidæa, to let Aegina be independent, to revoke the Megarian decree, and they conclude with an ultimatum warning us to leave the Hellenes independent. I hope that none of you will think that we shall be going to war for a trifle if we refuse to revoke the Megarian decree, which appears at the forefront of their complaints, and the revocation of which is supposedly to save us from war. Nor should any feeling of self-reproach linger in your minds, as if you went to war for a slight cause. Why, this trifle contains the entire essence and test of your resolution. If you give way, you will instantly have to meet some greater demand, as having been frightened into obedience in the first instance. While a firm refusal will make them clearly understand that they must treat you more as equals. Make your decision, therefore, at once, either to submit before you are harmed, or, if we are to go to war, as I for one think we ought, to do so without caring whether the apparent cause be great or small. Be resolved against making concessions or consenting to an insecure tenure of our possessions. For all claims from an equal, urged upon a neighbor as commands before any attempt at legal settlement, be they great or be they small, have only one meaning, and that is slavery. As to the war and the resources of either party, a detailed comparison will not show you the inferiority of Athens. Personally engaged in cultivating their land, without funds either private or public, the Peloponnesians are also without experience in long wars across the sea, due to the strict limit which poverty imposes on their attacks upon each other. Powers of this description are quite incapable of often manning a fleet or often sending out an army. They cannot afford the absence from their homes, the expenditure from their own funds, and besides, they have no command of the sea. Capital, it must be remembered, sustains a war more than forced contributions. Farmers are a class of men always more ready to serve in person than with their purse. Confident that their lives will survive the dangers, they are by no means so sure that their funds will not be prematurely exhausted, especially if the war lasts longer than they expect, which it very likely will. In a single battle, the Peloponnesians and their allies may be able to defy all Hellas, but they are incapacitated from carrying on a war against a power different in character from their own. This is due to the lack of a single council chamber necessary for prompt and vigorous action, and the substitution of a diet composed of various races, in which every state possesses an equal vote, and each presses its own ends. This state of affairs generally results in no action at all. The great wish of some is to avenge themselves on a particular enemy. The great wish of others is to save their own money. Slow in assembling, they devote a very small fraction of their time to considering any public objective, most of it to pursuing their own aims. Meanwhile, each fancies that no harm will come of his neglect, that it is someone else's business to look after this or that for him. And so, with the same notion held by all separately, the common cause imperceptibly decays. But the principal point is the hindrance they will experience from lacking money, the slowness with which it comes and will cause delay. But the opportunities of war wait for no one. Again, we need not be alarmed either at the possibility of their raising fortifications in Attica or at their navy. It would be difficult for any system of fortifications to establish a rival city, even in times of peace, much more surely in an enemy's country, with Athens just as much fortified against it as it is against Athens. While a mere outpost might be able to do some harm to the countryside by incursions and by providing facilities for desertion, it can never prevent our sailing into their country and raising fortifications there and making reprisals with our powerful fleet. For our naval skill is of more use to us for service on land than their military skill for service at sea. Familiarity with the sea they will not find an easy acquisition. If you, who have been practicing at it ever since the Median invasion, have not yet brought it to perfection, is there any chance of anything considerable being achieved by an agricultural, non-seafaring population, who will besides be prevented from practicing by the constant presence of strong squadrons of observation from Athens? With a small squadron, they might risk an engagement, encouraging their ignorance by numbers. But the restraint of a strong force will prevent them from moving, and through lack of practice, they will grow more clumsy and consequently more timid. It must be kept in mind that seamanship, just like anything else, is a matter of art, and will not admit of being taken up occasionally as an occupation for times of leisure. On the contrary, it is so exacting as to leave leisure for nothing else. Even if they were to touch the money at Olympia or Delphi and try to entice our foreign sailors with the temptation of higher pay, that would only be a serious danger if we could not still be a match for them by embarking our own citizens and the resident aliens among us. But in fact, by this means, we are always a match for them. And, best of all, we have a larger and higher class of native coxswains and sailors among our own citizens than all the rest of Hellas combined. And to say nothing of the danger of such a step, None of our foreign sailors would consent to become an outlaw from his country and to take service with them and their hopes for the sake of a few days' high pay. This, I think, is a tolerably fair account of the position of the Peloponnesians. That of Athens is free from the defects I have criticized in them, and has other advantages of its own, which they can show nothing to equal. If they march against our country, we will sail against theirs, and it will then be found that the devastation of all Attica is not the same as that of even a fraction of the Peloponnese. For they will not be able to make up the deficiency except by a battle, while we have plenty of land both on the islands and the continent. The rule of the sea is indeed a great matter. Consider for a moment. Suppose that we were islanders. Can you conceive a more impregnable position? Well, this in future should, as far as possible, be our conception of our position. Dismissing all thought of our land and houses, we must vigilantly guard the sea and the city. No irritation we may feel for our land must provoke us to a battle with the numerical superiority of the Peloponnesians. A victory would only be succeeded by another battle against the same superiority. A reverse involves the loss of our allies, the source of our strength, who will not remain quiet a day after we become unable to march against them. We must lament not over the loss of houses and land, but of men's lives, since houses and land do not gain men, but men gain them. And if I had thought that I could persuade you, I would have bid you go out and lay them waste with your own hands, and show the Peloponnesians that this at any rate will not make you submit. I have many other reasons to hope for a favorable outcome, if you can consent not to combine schemes of fresh conquest with the conduct of the war, and will abstain from willfully involving yourselves in other dangers. Indeed, I am more afraid of our own blunders than of the enemy's devices. But these matters shall be explained in another speech, as events require. For the present, dismiss these men with the answer that we will allow Megara the use of our market and harbors when the Lacedaemonians suspend their alien acts in favor of us and our allies, there being nothing in the treaty to prevent either one or the other. We will leave the cities independent, if independent we found them when we made the treaty, and when the Lacedaemonians grant to their cities an independence not involving subservience to Lacedaemonian interests, but such as each severally may desire. We are willing to give the legal satisfaction which our agreements specify, and we shall not commence hostilities, but shall resist those who do commence them. This is an answer agreeable at once to the rights and the dignity of Athens. It must be thoroughly understood that war is a necessity, but that the more readily we accept it, the less will be the ardor of our opponents, and that out of the greatest dangers, communities and individuals acquire the greatest glory. Did not our fathers resist the Medes, not only with resources far different from ours, but even when those resources had been abandoned, and more by wisdom than by fortune, more by daring than by strength? Did they not beat off the foreign invader and advance their affairs to their present height? We must not fall behind them, but must resist our enemies in any way and in every way, and attempt to hand down our power to our posterity unimpaired. Such are the words of Pericles. The Athenians, persuaded of the wisdom of his advice, voted as he desired, and answered the Lacedaemonians as he recommended, both on the separate points and in general. They would do nothing under dictation, but were ready to have the complaints settled in a fair and impartial manner by the legal method, which the terms of the truce prescribed. So the envoys departed home and did not return again. These were the charges and differences existing between the rival powers before the war, arising immediately from the affair at Epidamnus and Corcyra. Still, intercourse continued in spite of them, and mutual communication. It was carried on without heralds, but not without suspicion, as events were occurring which were equivalent to a breach of the treaty and cause for war.